Hey everyone, per your requests, I'm starting Sword of Coming, chapters 571 through 580 of the previous episode. Upon reaching the secluded Golden Osmanthus Temple, Qian Ping'an ensures the gentle Earth Bull's safety by sending it underground to hide. He then brings Pei Qian Zhang Feng and Su Yuanxia to tour the ancestral Osmanthus trees, where his deep knowledge of historical sword immortals subtly astounds the local priests. After returning to a mountain village, Qian Ping'an's warm interactions with a local martial arts clan are cut short when Zhang Shanfeng's high-tier master suddenly arrives to whisk the young priest away to Mount Longhu. Left behind, Su Yuanxia also departs to return to his long-lost home, leaving Qian Ping'an with a profound sense of parting sorrow. However, his melancholy is interrupted by the dramatic arrival of his enigmatic, eccentric white-robed disciple, Cui Dongshan. While skeptical of Cui's intentions, Qian Ping'an accompanies him to investigate a corrupted local martial sage temple, learning about the grand flow of the nation's martial fortune, and a proposed political transaction from the Great Li Empire regarding his pure martial artist companions. Though deeply concerned about the shifting dark undercurrents and hidden motives surrounding the upcoming Grand Capital debate, Qian Ping'an maintains firm moral boundaries with his volatile disciple, preparing to head toward the capital while cautiously keeping Cui Dongshan under his watchful eye. If possible, you can support me via PayPal or become a channel member to help me keep this channel running. Thank you. Now let's get back to the story of Sword of Coming audio series. Chapter 581. After placing Pei Qian's treasure box back inside his bamboo bookcase, Qian Ping'an left the inn by himself and casually wandered around the county city to experience the local customs and traditions. Even though the county city was small, it still contained all of the necessary essentials. There was a scholarly temple and a martial sage temple, a county office and a private school, and all kinds of shops and stalls selling a variety of different things. There was everything that one could wish for. There were uneven and muddy paths, willow trees that were sprouting new branches, crowing roosters and barking dogs, and brand new spring couplets and door gods. There were merchants from foreign lands bustling about and peddling goods with no set location, and there were also little children sprinting through the streets, with most of them still wearing brand new clothes they had been given for the new year. They were filled with energy and vigor. Qian Ping'an continued to wander around, and before he knew it, he had arrived at the martial sage temple. On the way, he had also passed a god of wealth temple that was enjoying a relatively large number of worshippers and incense offerings compared to the scholarly temple. Qian Ping'an had traveled tens of thousands of kilometers these past few years, and he had discovered something very interesting. Ordinary mortals seemingly respected yet were distant from the temples of larger gods, yet they were quite attracted to the shrines and temples of smaller gods and deities such as the god of wealth, the mountain lords, and all kinds of female deities. For example, in the Azure Phoenix nation that was filled with Buddhist temples and Taoist temples, commoners would often offer incense to the gods in the main hall, and that was that. They wouldn't stay in the main hall for a long time. However, they would often kowtow sincerely before the feet of the gods and deities who were responsible for ruling over some specific matter. After doing this, they would quietly murmur their hopes and wishes. Qian Ping'an entered the martial sage temple that only had a small handful of worshippers right now. The divine statue in this temple was a painted clay statue of a martial general, who had a ferocious expression and was holding a steel truncheon. It was an extremely dignified-looking statue. The most important task when one advanced to the 6th tier was to acquire a hero's gall pill, something similar to the golden cores of chi refiners. There were two main ways to do that. The first option was to visit a martial sage temple and try your luck. Maybe you could obtain the favor of a martial sage, and thus obtain a wisp of martial fortune. The second option was to visit the ruins of an ancient battlefield and battle with the dead heroes' souls that were unwilling to disperse. However, this was very dangerous, as there were few heroic spirits that would wander around by themselves in the ruins of ancient battlefields. Many times, those generals with a heroic spirit would still possess intelligence and command an army of many commanders and a great many soldiers, making them incredibly difficult to defeat. The immortal book that Qian Ping'an had purchased in Stalactite Mountain described a gigantic battlefield ruin in the Middle-earth Divine Continent. In that ancient battlefield ruin, there was a heroic spirit that was as powerful as a 12th tier chi refiner, and also possessed control over the area, similar to how militarian sages could control battlefields. Because of this, The heroic spirit was essentially as powerful as legendary Ascension tier cultivators. Not only that, but the heroic spirit also commanded an army of several 100,000 soldiers and many generals. According to rumors, the heavenly masters of Mount Longhu all needed to enter this ancient battlefield to train before they could be promoted to great heavenly masters. Many tragic deaths had occurred because of this requirement. Chen Ping'an had never held on to the hope that he could receive the blessings of a martial sage temple. He had simply strolled over here by coincidence today. Indeed, he yearned to visit those ancient battlefield ruins that were renowned in the history books, and he wished to advance to the 6th tier of martial arts through his fists and his own hard work. Chen Ping'an was all by himself as he stood in the main hall of the martial sage temple. The martial sage temple of the county city was very small, so there wasn't anywhere to purchase incense in the temple. Instead, worshippers would need to prepare and bring incense here by themselves. Chen Ping'an felt like it would be inappropriate to put his palms together in prayer, so he decided to cup his hands instead, paying respects to the martial sage using the customs of a martial artist. He then turned around and left. The warm sunshine of spring shone outside the main hall. Chen Ping'an stepped over the door threshold. With his bridge of immortality reconstructed and his first bonded item refined, it could be said that Chen Ping'an had now put one foot through the door of becoming a legitimate qi refiner. However, this most certainly wasn't some kind of divine fortune. After all, there were few situations in the world where one could have their cake and eat it too. This was especially the case since qi refiners and pure martial artists cultivated according to principles that were not just different, but simply incompatible. This wasn't to say that there didn't exist cultivators who were both qi refiners and pure martial artists, but even among several different worlds there were very few. Some sword cultivators from the Sword Qi Great Wall, a few Taoist priests from the Taoist Saber Room, and the several types of cultivation freaks that Cui Chan had unintentionally mentioned before all belonged to this rare category. Why did orthodox cultivators view this type of dual cultivation as foolish? This was because the further one advanced, the more likely it was that one would come across dangerous and near-fatal flaws. It was already difficult enough for qi refiners to form golden cores, and it would be orders of magnitude harder for them to vanquish their internal demons when they broke through to the nascent tier. When Buddhist monks cultivated their indestructible golden physiques, and when Taoist priests refined their untainted physiques, they were indeed both embarking on the tireless journey of achieving flawlessness. When it came to martial arts cultivation, cultivators were further pursuing the notion of purity. If one chose to walk two paths in parallel, however, that would essentially be equivalent to asking for pain and trouble. It was very likely that one would fall short on both paths and eventually limit their own potential. Chen Ping'an was just about to step over the door threshold of the main hall with his right foot as well, yet the spiritual energy behind him rippled, bringing with it a rich and mellow voice that said, "Please wait a moment, esteemed immortal." Chen Ping'an stepped back before turning around and returning inside the main hall. A layer of golden light shimmered over the painted statue of the martial sage, after which a middle-aged general in golden armor walked out from the statue and arrived in the main hall. The martial sage hailing from this part of the Azure Phoenix nation cupped his fists and said with a smile, "I need to thank your esteemed disciple for resolving the troubles that plagued the scholarly temple and the martial sage temple, allowing us to survive this calamity. Esteemed immortal, can you please grant us an opportunity to thank you? Please feel free to let us know if you need anything. The scholarly temple and the martial sage temple definitely won't refuse if it's something that we can do." Chen Ping'an smiled and replied, "It was purely my disciple's decision to help this time, and it had nothing at all to do with me. As such, there's no need to thank me, martial sage. I only came here by coincidence today, so I apologize if I've disturbed you." "I wish I could be disturbed more." The martial sage sighed in helplessness. Chen Ping'an didn't know how to respond. The Tao of gods and deities was truly the most mysterious and mystical. Chen Ping'an didn't have anything else to attend to right now, so he decided to find a straw mat to sit down on. After setting up some illusion techniques to avoid frightening the mortal commoners, the martial sage also sat down on a straw mat. Chen Ping'an asked some questions pertaining to the origin and etiquette of the scholarly temple and the martial sage temple, and he also asked some questions regarding scholarly cores. These latter questions didn't appear out of place when weaved in with all of his other questions. The martial sage answered Chen Ping'an's questions one by one, revealing everything that he knew. After receiving satisfactory answers to all of his questions, Qian Ping'an stood up to thank the martial sage before taking his leave. The martial sage saw the young man off to the entrance of the main hall. After the young esteemed immortal disappeared into the distance, the martial sage also returned inside his clay statue to rest. A young man in white walked along the streets of the county city, walking past the lush green trees, walking past the dogs lying stretched on the ground and basking in the sun, and walking past the cheerfully laughing children. The young man continued to murmur to himself the entire time. At your age, there are always things that you can't do. There are also things that you can try your best to do, but you still won't be able to do them well. But what does this matter? It doesn't matter. In addition, not doing well enough is distinct from doing something wrong. You don't need be afraid if you commit a mistake while you're young. But being young isn't an excuse to give up and refuse to change. If you have reasonable parents, then your parents will scold you when you do something wrong. If you go to school, then your teacher will strike your palm with a ruler if you make a mistake. Little Baoping had Mr. Qi and also has her older brother, Li Shixing. Chao Qinglang had his parents and he's going to school now. But you never had any of these things. Well, it doesn't matter. I'll be the one to teach you. But what will be the best way to teach you? There was no one to teach me when I was your age. The young man from a foreign land walked past some very ordinarily written spring couplets and breezed past a couple of poorly illustrated door gods. He was in no hurry to return to the inn. Qian Ping'an suddenly recalled something, and he turned into a secluded alley and retrieved a yellow paper talisman from his jade tablet minimization treasure. This was none other than the yellow paper talisman that housed the beautiful skeletal ghost from the colorful garment nation. While Qian Ping'an was traveling to Stalactite Mountain on Osmanthus Island, Aunt Gui and Maji, the golden core tier sword cultivator, had helped him establish a contract with the female bone ghost. However, Qian Ping'an had suffered greatly at the hands of a female ghost wearing a bright red wedding dress during his younger days, so he had an innate dislike of ghosts and entities who caused trouble. After leaving Osmanthus Island, he had never allowed the female bone ghost to leave the yellow paper talisman, not even once. Now that she was finally released into the world again, it was only normal that she felt some slight discomfort. She appeared lithe and beautiful as she stood in the shadows, yet she also exuded a concentrated and chilly energy. She was wearing an exquisite and colorful dress with large sleeves, and both of her hands were hidden inside these sleeves. However, Qian Ping'an was well aware that apart from her beautiful face, the female ghost was nothing but a rack of bones from her neck down. The beautiful skeletal ghost curtsied to Qian Ping'an, revealing 2 sections of snow-white wrist bones. She appeared feminine and frail as she said, "This maidservant pays respects to master." Qian Ping'an didn't know where to begin, so he couldn't help but hesitate. When establishing the contract, Qian Ping'an had learned that the true name of this beautiful skeletal ghost was Shiro. Qian Ping'an continued to rack his brain for words as he remained vigilant of whether there was anyone walking past nearby. Shiro smiled and asked, "Master, do you need this servant to deal with some impure matters?" "There's no need to hesitate, master. It's my duty as a servant to deal with these matters for you." Qian Ping'an sighed and shook his head, replying, "I don't need you to do anything dirty and unable to see the light of day. You're a lady, so I want to ask you some things that you might have more expertise in." Shiro narrowed her eyes and remarked, "Oh? Dare I ask, master, does this pertain to the intimate relationships between men and women?" She smiled and extended a skeletal arm out of her large sleeves, covering her mouth as she chuckled. However, her eyes were ice cold as she continued. "Who would have thought that you had such a strange fetish? This is truly a blessing for this maidservant." Qian Ping'an paid no heed to her thinly veiled taunts, and he asked in exasperation, "Would it kill you if you waited for me to finish? I want to ask you whether you ever married, gave birth and educated children before. Do you know how to establish rules for children and juniors in the family?" Shiro was utterly confused by Qian Ping'an's question. It was clear that this question was completely beyond her expectations. When her soul was trapped in that picture scroll in the past, the old immortal had always instructed her to assist him in his sinister and malicious deeds. She had gone against her conscience and done many revolting things, and that was still a better option than watching the souls of her sisters shatter and disperse. Even so, some pitiful sisters of hers had suffered the vile wrath of that old immortal, with their souls lit up like candles through an extraordinarily sinister immortal technique. Their souls would become candle wicks that slowly burned down, causing them unbearable pain as they tragically faded from the world. Apart from her, Ro, who else had dared to go against that old immortal, now that she had a new master? Why were things suddenly so different? She breathed a sigh of relief and shook her head, replying, "My apologies, master. I never married when I was alive, and I have little understanding of what you are asking for." Qian Pingan nodded and summoned her back inside the yellow paper talisman without saying another word. He then placed the talisman back inside his jade tablet minimization treasure. There was a dumbfounded expression on the face of the hovering female bone ghost, as she was thrown back inside the darkness of the talisman prison. That was all? Ro felt slightly irritated and regretful. If she had known this earlier, then perhaps she could have made up some nonsense to trick him for a while. Just how long had she been trapped here for? How long had it been since she had last seen the outside world? She would have been willing to stay outside for a little longer, even if it meant astral winds brushing past her like blades through her flesh and spring thunder rumbling over her like blades scraping her bones. Qian Pingan walked out of the alley, eventually stopping on the steps of a residence with tightly shut doors. He sat down, hugging his knees as he stared blankly into the distance. A family of 3 walked past. The child was innocent and pure, and he didn't have a worry in the world. The rims of the woman's eyes were red. It seemed she was upset about something. The man smiled apologetically and consoled her, and there was a long strip of meat wrapped in oil paper in his hand. However, the more the man consoled her, the angrier the woman became. In the end, she directly grabbed her son's hand and briskly walked away, leaving her husband languishing behind by himself. The man bent down in slight exhaustion. He had accompanied his wife to visit her family just then, and of the 2 other sons-in-law, one was an official from the local government and one a teacher who taught at private schools for wealthy families. As for him, he was nothing more than a farmer. When offering return gifts, his father-in-law had given his 2 other sons-in-law a pork leg each. However, he had been singled out and given a thin strip of meat. He was naturally angry, and this also caused his wife to feel annoyed with him. However, as a man, could he possibly argue with his wife in front of their young son? At the end of the day, was this not caused by his own incompetence? The man heaved a sigh. However, he suddenly noticed an unfamiliar young man sitting on the front steps of a residence not far away from where he was walking. The man subconsciously straightened his back and smiled at Qian Pingan. Only after doing this did he jog after his wife and son, who were walking further and further into the distance. Looking at this scene, Qian Pingan could sympathize with how these trivial matters would slowly drain a person. Even though there was no common language between them, Qian Pingan had also grown up in an impoverished family in Clay Vase Alley. Thus, he was well aware of the bumps and challenges that face people on the bottom rungs of society. Because of this, Qian Pingan surmised that the young boy would gradually start to understand his parents' pains and worries when he eventually grew older. Perhaps he would study harder at school, perhaps he would smile a lot less, or perhaps he would realize that the father whom he admired was actually a little pathetic. Perhaps he would start to disdain his father just like his mother did. Of course, it was also possible that he would help his father carry the thin strip of meat while returning home today. Upon seeing this, perhaps his parents would also reconcile and become as intimate as before. Perhaps they would feel like it was still okay to live on. Anything was possible. Pei Qian was transcribing texts in her room. When she finished transcribing the required number of characters, she quietly snuck over to her door to eavesdrop on what was happening outside. However, she didn't hear any footsteps even after waiting for a long time. She leaned against the door and squatted down, looking at the tips of her toes. In the beginning, she had suffered many blisters on the soles of her feet because she hadn't been accustomed to trekking across the mountain paths. However, she hadn't dared to poke her blisters. At that time, someone had squatted down beside her and helped her pop them one by one. After rubbing some medicinal herb paste on her feet, the popped blisters didn't hurt anymore. While Pei Qian was staring blankly at her feet, a familiar voice suddenly sounded outside her door. "Have you finished transcribing the text today?" Pei Qian immediately jumped up, loudly replying, "Yep, I've finished transcribing them. The footsteps gradually faded away. She then heard the neighboring door softly open and close. Cui Yubian didn't open the door for Cui Dongshan. Even when Cui Dongshan told her that he could elevate her sword techniques, sword intent, and perhaps even her sword Dao by a significant amount, allowing her to essentially gain an immortal sword billet for free, Cui Yubian still remained steadfast and refused to open the door. Cui Dongshan stood outside her room and rubbed his chin. After pondering for a while, he changed his tactic and asked Cui Yubian whether she wanted to learn about the demeanor of true sword immortals in the majestic world. Cui Yubian remained indifferent, and she used a small dragon-slaying platform to sharpen deep infatuation in her room. She had purchased this piece of dragon-slaying platform from Chan Ping'an, and it was only as thick as her hand. This dragon-slaying platform could be regarded as a leftover piece from 1st and 15th so-called meals. Even though deep infatuation was an immortal treasure crafted by a cultivator to begin with, and it was possible to increase its quality even further, it wasn't a bonded flying sword nurtured by a sword cultivator. In other words, it was still an inanimate object. Thus, Cui Yubian couldn't toss her dragon-slaying platform to deep infatuation and let the sword do its own thing like how Chan Ping'an could toss his dragon-slaying platform to 1st and 15th. Cui Yubian needed to spend time and effort to temper deep infatuation. Brilliant and mystical sparks of various colors flew through the air as Cui Yubian sharpened her blade. She was aware that dragon-slaying platforms were regarded as the most precious sword whetstones in the world, yet she did not know why this was the case. Even so, Cui Yubian still reaped great benefits through the process of using her dragon-slaying platform to sharpen deep infatuation. Like gathering and dispersing clouds, wisps of fine and exquisite sword chi shimmered and formed some agile patterns that quickly appeared and disappeared on the blade of her sword. Deep infatuation radiated with intensity. It was as if she wasn't sharpening deep infatuation alone. It was as if she was also tempering her own sword heart, which was already bright and pure to begin with. Cui Dongshan found the situation slightly strange. He had come across dozens if not hundreds of people who were extremely passionate about swords like Cui Yubian, and he knew that the minds of these people were actually very simple. To put it in a positive way, their mindset could be described as sincere. To put it negatively, it could be called stubborn. In any case, it was a mindset solely focused on pursuing the sword Dao. Observing how Cui Yubian nurtured her sword chi every day, however, it was clear that her true pursuit was sword intent, something that differed greatly from the pursuits of sword experts. It was clear that Cui Yubian intended to switch paths, going from a martial artist to a chi refiner. She was determined to become a top-notch sword immortal in the majestic world. Moreover, she was a naive lady who felt like the world revolved around her. Taking all of these things into account, she shouldn't have been as dithering as she was right now. In reality, Cui Dongshan could have revealed something that would have definitely tempted Cui Yubian. However, he was unwilling to use up all of his trump cards so soon. After returning to his room and closing the door, Cui Dongshan forcefully stomped his foot and summoned the local mountain lord. The mountain lord was a shapely woman dressed in bold and vibrant attire. Quite a rare sight indeed. Cui Dongshan stood beside his bed before leaning back and sprawling himself across the bed. He then kicked his boots off, and he instructed the lowly ranked mountain lord to massage his feet for him. The shapely woman obediently squatted down beside his feet and gently massaged them. The heavens chilly and the earth freezing, the 4 seasons cycled one after another. Birth, aging, sickness, and death. Such was the natural cycle of life. Those who ingested qi survived, and this was one of the origins of qi refiners. This pertained to the true foundations of the great Tao. The sages once said that those who eat meat possess courage and boldness, those who eat grains possess wisdom and shrewdness, those who ingest qi gain the lifespan of deities, and those who ingest nothing gain godhood before death. The first 3 points were very easy to understand, yet the final point was quite subtle and difficult to understand. This was due to the fact that the Tao couldn't be revealed, and it was also because the implications behind this point were far too big of a taboo. This pertained to the dead end faced by pure martial artists, and it also pertained to the sage's desire to prevent those in the future generations from tracing the roots of the Tao of gods and deities. However, Cui Dongshan was aware of the 3 minor tiers that belonged to the 10th tier of martial arts. There was the thriving qi tier, the simplification tier, and the divinity tier. The Great Li Empire Song Chongjing was most likely still at the thriving Qi tier. Yet Li Er, who had advanced to the N tier after Song Chongjing, had already advanced to the simplification tier. Cui Dongshan had been astonished when he had first heard this news. In fact, Cui Dongshan had been so astonished that he had run over to pummel Yulu, the young man who was aimlessly wandering around with Prince Gao Xian of the Great Sui nation all the time. The battered and bruised Yulu didn't dare to fight back, and it was very likely that he was still completely stumped as to why Cui Dongshan was suddenly punishing him. He was even more baffled by what Cui Dongshan said afterward. You might have toilet paper in your hand in the future, but beware that there might not be a toilet for you to take a shit in. Cui Dongshan was feeling worried for his little lackey. Different empires and nations would have varying levels of martial fortune, so was it not the case that different continents would also have differing levels of martial fortune? The Eastern Treasured Vial continent was the smallest continent in the majestic world to begin with, yet Song Chongjing had already reached the N tier of martial arts at such a young age. Soon afterward, Li Er had traveled to the complete Reed continent and surprisingly overtaken Song Chongjing, advancing to the simplification tier of the 10th tier of martial arts. Moreover, there was still that old man. It was said that his temperament had changed considerably, and he had now become a carefree and secluded cultivator in the bamboo building in downtrodden mountain. Thus, if it weren't for Zheng Dafeng suffering great misfortune in Old Dragon City, and being turned from someone with the potential to reach the N tier into a useless cripple, then it was very likely that the dead end faced by pure martial artists in the Eastern Treasured Vial continent wouldn't be the 10th tier anymore. Instead, it would directly plummet to the 9th tier. Of course, there was also Chen Ping'an to consider now, and there were also his 4 subordinates who had left the Lotus Flower-blessed land and suddenly materialized in the Eastern Treasured Vial continent. As Cui Dongshan's 2 servants, couldn't Yu Lu and Xie pay some attention and hurry over to a toilet reserved for 10th tier martial artists? Otherwise, they would have nowhere to take a shit in the future. Yu Lu was a remnant evil of the Lu clan. He was the crown prince of the destroyed Lu Empire, after all, so it was only natural that he was viewed that way. His martial arts cultivation base was continually climbing, and the most critical point was that his footsteps were relatively solid and stable. Apart from possessing extraordinary martial arts talent, this was also in large part thanks to his father, the emperor of the Lu Empire, going crazy and transferring half of the empire's martial fortune to his son. In the eyes of sages, were pure martial artists not pieces of rock in a cesspit? Were they not hard, foul-smelling, and pathetic? Cui Dongshan felt very anxious and upset. There were far too many idiots in the world, and these idiots didn't understand his foresight and worries at all. In the past, it was shitty little children like Xie and Yu Lu, and now there were also these 4 subordinates following Chen Ping'an around. A little Baoping was truly the best. It was just that the temper of the little girl wearing the bright red jacket was a bit too explosive. Cui Dongshan lay down on his bed and placed a hand on his forehead. He was in a bad mood right now, so he directly sent the shapely mountain lord of the county city flying with a single kick. The mountain lord smashed into the wall. Of course, regardless of how low her divine rank was, she was still a deity who enjoyed incense offerings from the mortal world, so she was able to avoid making noise as she crashed. She hurriedly stood back up and she was trembling in apprehension as she said, "Please calm down, esteemed immortal. This humble servant apologizes for being so foolish." Not long ago, this esteemed immortal from a foreign land and with a mysterious background had visited the martial sage temple of the county city and directly dragged her out from her simple underground residence. After doing this, he had then flicked his sleeve and pulled the martial sage out from his gold statue. After asking some questions and understanding the situation, he had immediately resolved the deep hostility between the 2 relevant parties. Thanks to this esteemed immortal's help, the gold statues of the 2 deities in the scholarly temple and the martial sage temple had regained their purity. However, the reaction of the other party had been even more incomprehensible than this. The clan of that young immortal disciple had been beaming with joy, as if they had obtained some kind of huge benefit. It was inevitable that the mountain lord feared this esteemed immortal. A young abode tier chi refiner from the mountains had almost turned the county city on its head. Yet in her estimations, this esteemed immortal from a foreign land was at least a powerful earth immortal. She definitely couldn't provoke him. The two deities from the scholarly temple and the martial sage temple had both been extremely bold and stubborn people when alive, yet they had both agreed to his request and been willing to act as door gods for him. They would stand outside the inn for an entire night to express their gratitude. Meanwhile, she was only a measly mountain lord who fed on their scraps. How could she dare to oppose this esteemed immortal? Cui Dongshan walked over and sat down in front of the table. There was a stack of books which he had casually purchased during the journey, most of them famous works by renowned literati in the Azure Phoenix Nation. Cui Dongshan randomly picked a book to read. However, he immediately started to yawn after reading just a few pages. He waved at the shapely woman and instructed, "Come here and help me flip the pages." The mountain lord hurriedly walked over to flip the pages for the handsome young boy. This required some skills, and she needed to pay close attention to his gaze. Otherwise, she would definitely offend the young esteemed immortal if she flipped the pages too early or too late. Cui Dongshan read another few pages before waving his hand and saying in a dismissive voice, "All right, you're free to go now. There's nothing else for you to do here." The mountain lord didn't dare to let her happiness and relief show. She was just about to take her leave, yet she suddenly recalled something, and she debated whether she should inform the young esteemed immortal about this. In the end, she gritted her teeth and recounted what she had witnessed before to Cui Dongshan. This pertained to Chan Ping'an's short trip from the inn to the martial sage temple. After leaving the temple, he had then entered a secluded alley and summoned the beautiful woman from a yellow paper talisman. The shapely woman was a mountain lord, after all, so it was as if she were hiding among nature when she remained underground. Even cultivators at the middle 5 tiers would find it extremely difficult to detect her presence. Of course, it was a different story for Earth immortals. After listening to the mountain lord's words, Cui Dongshan smiled and remarked that she had made a significant contribution. However, he immediately flicked his sleeve and almost shattered her soul. He stopped himself at the last moment, and he even helped her restabilize her godly body afterward. The mountain lord only lost 7 or 8 ounces of incense essence, or else it would have been time for the county city to look for a new mountain lord. Even so, it would still take her close to 60 years to accumulate this amount of incense essence from the mortal world again. She was astonished and terrified, and her heart was also bleeding at this devastating loss. However, she still didn't dare to show any hint of anger. Instead, she fell to her knees and begged for mercy, sobbing, "Please forgive me, esteemed immortal." Cui Dongshan pondered for a moment before smiling widely and replying, "You've made such a huge contribution, so I should reward you and promote you to the position of formal mountain god or river god in the Azure Phoenix Nation. As for secretly observing my master without permission, this should be a death penalty. A contribution is a contribution, and a crime is a crime. We need to be clear about this, and a contribution shouldn't cancel out a crime. You should have died just then, and you couldn't have been promoted to a higher position even if I wanted to help you. As for the situation right now, just go home and wait for good fortune to befall you." Cui Dongshan didn't reveal the reason why he had spared her in the end. The mountain lord returned underground with a delighted expression. The unexpected circumstance in the colorful garment nation was none other than one of the many pieces that he had placed on the go board all those years ago. To be more precise, it was one of the many pieces that they had placed. The lecherous old cultivator who liked to collect beautiful female ghosts couldn't be regarded as an especially important piece. Cui Dongshan hadn't spent much time and effort on him in the past. However, among the countless secret letters sent back by spies that had flooded into the capital of the Greatly Empire like snowflakes, Cui Dongshan had paid slightly more attention to one certain letter. This secret had been very short, with only 20 or so characters to roughly explain the situation. It was very likely that the spy who had written this letter hadn't treated the matter with any sort of importance either. If this were in the past matters, which the imperial preceptor of the Greatly Empire treated as trivially amusing matters to pass time, would suffer a fate similar to the mountain of secret letters in the secret chamber of the Greatly Empire. They would be sealed away and ignored for many years. After conducting some investigations due to boredom, and because he was in possession of countless secrets of the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, Cui Chan dared to say that he understood the background of the beautiful skeletal ghost even better than her previous master. To cull phrases left and right, such was the act of old literati, To follow clues to uncover the truth, such was the act of naturalists. Imperial preceptor Cui Chan was impressively skilled in both of these areas. Cui Dongshan stood up and left his room, walking down the corridor before stopping and knocking on Chen Pingan's door. Chen Pingan opened the door and asked, "Is something the matter?" Cui Dongshan nodded vigorously and replied, "I have a hugely important matter to discuss with you, master." Chen Pingan shot a glance at him, and Cui Dongshan smiled faintly as he continued, "However, it's up to your luck whether this succeeds or not." Chen Pingan started to shut the door, yet Cui Dongshan reacted very quickly and hurriedly extended both hands, forcefully keeping the wooden door open. "Please allow me to slowly explain, master," he begged in an aggrieved voice. "If things are as I suspect, yet you are unwilling to listen to me, then you will squander a huge treasure. In fact, 2 precious treasures will be wasted at once, and you will pointlessly let slip a profound fated opportunity that you should have been destined to receive. I promise, I'm definitely not speaking a single lie." Cui Dongshan thought that Chen Pingan would definitely shut the door on him, meaning that he would need to find another opportunity in the future. Unexpectedly, however, Chen Pingan actually opened the door and let him in. Cui Dongshan entered and shut the door behind him. He grinned as he sat down, and he poured a cup of tea for Chen Pingan and himself. He then set up a restriction, summoning the flying sword that he had won from a sword cultivator from the Middle-earth divine continent in a gamble. A flash of golden light rapidly flew around in a circle just above the ground before returning to Cui Dongshan's glabella. The golden light on the floor didn't disperse, and it was as if someone had used golden powder to draw a golden well on the floor. Cui Dongshan smiled and explained, "The female mountain lord here was quite bold and impertinent, and she actually dared to tail you during your trip to the martial sage temple. She witnessed some things that she shouldn't have witnessed, and even worse than that, she actually dared to ask me for a reward afterward. Does she not understand the concept of respect toward heaven, earth, rulers, parents, and teachers?" "So you killed her?" Chen Pingan asked. Cui Dongshan chuckled and replied, "Why, of course not. I simply explained some reasons and principles to her in a calm and friendly manner, telling her not to make the same mistake again in the future. The Mountain Lord was also an understanding individual, and it was quite clear that she took my words to heart. Because of this, I blessed her with some fortune and essentially formed a small but positive karmic bond between us." Chen Pingan wasted no time to expose his bullshit. "If you hadn't needed to come here to look for me, I assume this female mountain lord would have already been wiped from the genealogical records of the Azure Phoenix Nation." Cui Dongshan smiled sheepishly and replied, "You have a deeply wrong impression of me, master. Regardless of the time or the matter, your disciple is always treating others with kindness and respect now." Chen Pingan drank a sip of tea and said, Right. Anyway, since you're here, let's discuss the proper matters." Cui Dongshan also drank some tea to moisten his throat before weighing each word and saying carefully, "Regarding that seemingly useless immortal body, if you're lucky, perhaps you can do something that will please everyone." Chen Pingan widened his eyes in shock and exclaimed, "Cui Dongshan, have you gone mad? To say nothing of whether that female ghost has strong enough bones by naturalist standards, it won't make a difference even if you ignore these important matters and focus on the more trivial aspects instead. No matter how you slice it, you can't change the fact that she's a female ghost. A woman. And this immortal body is Du Mao's young soul avatar." Cui Dongshan gently twirled the teacup in his hand, with his expression calm and composed as he looked at Chen Pingan and asked, "Why are you worrying about these things? Even if someone needs to worry about them, it should be the ghost herself, no? Is there any need for you to worry in her place?" Chen Pingan was taken aback upon hearing this, yet he surprisingly nodded and said, "That makes sense. You're not going to say, but?" Cui Dongshan asked with a chuckle. With a single thought, Chen Pingan summoned a yellow paper talisman made from special materials and caused it to materialize on the table. The talisman fluttered a little, and Chen Pingan used a relatively normal door-opening technique belonging to the talismanic branch, releasing Shiro from the talisman that was both her home and her cage. Shiro materialized on the table, with her colorful garment draping over its surface. Cui Dongshan looked up at her. Shiro looked down, only to see a handsome young boy with a birthmark on his glabella. Even though he didn't speak, it was very clear that his eyes were asking her a simple question. Do you want to die? Ro had no clue about this person's background, and she couldn't even determine the level of his cultivation base. Even so, a sense of instinctive fear still welled up in her heart. She immediately hovered to the ground and turned around, not daring to face that handsome young boy anymore. She faced Qian Ping'an instead, yet she still felt as if a piercing gaze were stabbing through her back. Ro lowered her gaze, and she put on a relatively sincere and gentle expression in a rare display. She then said to Qian Ping'an, "This humble servant pays her respects to master." Cui Dongshan stood up, smiling as he rubbed his hands together in eagerness. Qian Ping'an nodded to him, gesturing for him to go ahead. Cui Dongshan reached over and placed a hand on the beautiful skeletal ghost's shoulder, causing her to feel as if she had been struck by lightning. A boundless murderous aura erupted from her body, and her expression also became twisted as her hair billowed wildly in the air. Cui Dongshan paid no heed to this, and he simply raised his hand and slowly lifted her a foot off the ground. He then tightened his grip, lifting her another foot into the air. However, Cui Dongshan didn't stop there, and he lifted Ro higher for the third time, causing her bones to instantly become loose. It was as if she had been transformed into a sack of broken flesh with no bones. She was like a puppet being forcefully raised into the air, so that she wouldn't collapse into a heap on the floor. Cui Dongshan released his grip, yet Ro remained hanging in midair, with her soul trembling in unrest. Wisps of innate murderous aura flowed out from all of the orifices on her face, similar to how people might sometimes bleed after suffering severe wounds. Ro opened her mouth wide as if screaming in agony, yet not a single sound was made. Cui Dongshan walked around her a single time. He hadn't raised her higher into the air 3 times for no reason. He had used the measuring technique of fortune tellers the first time, and this had allowed him to measure the bone qi of the female ghost. He had used the so-called growth acceleration technique of ancient shamans the second time, and he had then used an even more secretive technique the third time, one that he himself had improved. This final technique was derived from a mystical reading ability that Confucian sages had created, similar to the 8-direction attack reading technique. At a minimum, one needed to be the mountain master of a Confucian academy to master this technique. Apart from owning a myriad of immortal treasures, Cui Dongshan had also mastered a huge number of secret techniques, so many that he would rank among the top few people in the majestic world. Cui Dongshan stole a glance at Qian Ping'an, only to find that his master was completely unfazed. By the looks of it, Qian Ping'an was no longer that impoverished young boy wearing straw sandals. He was no longer as naive as before. Cui Dongshan pushed aside these thoughts and took out a lesser heat coin, flicking it toward Ro's glabella. The beautiful skeletal ghost collapsed to the floor, and her shoulders started to tremble as she used her bony hands to support her body. She couldn't even raise her head anymore, and it was clear that she had suffered immensely at the hands of Cui Dongshan. "How is it?" Qian Ping'an asked. "Not too bad, your luck is only so," Cui Dongshan replied with a soft sigh. The two of them sat opposite each other again. Qian Ping'an looked at Ro, who was stumbling around as she stood up, and he asked, "I have an unoccupied body that's essentially at the immortal tier. Are you willing to reside inside this body?" Ro was stunned into silence. She genuinely couldn't believe her ears. This was an immense fated opportunity, so how could a measly entity like her possibly handle it? To say nothing of cultivators at the golden core tier and nascent tier, whom ordinary mortals viewed as terrestrial immortals. Even those at the unpolished jade tier would covet an immortal body shed by a paramount cultivator. In fact, even supremely powerful immortal tier cultivators might be deeply tempted by such an incredible treasure. After all, one could refine this immortal body and use it as a suit of armor for their wandering soul, allowing their soul to have drastically improved offensive and defensive capabilities. That would essentially be giving wings to tigers. Even though she was a lowly entity, otherwise she wouldn't have been so easily captured and manipulated by an old cultivator who was yet to become an earth immortal. Her knowledge was actually quite impressive due to some specific circumstances. Ro suddenly hovered toward the door before turning around and falling to her knees, kowtowing to both Cui Dongshan and Qian Ping'an as she begged in a tearful voice, "Please show me some mercy. Please allow this humble servant to gain a body, and have the ability to openly walk in the Yang world." In exchange, I'm willing to become your servant forever and ever. Cui Dongshan flared up in rage, and he immediately raised a hand and made a slapping motion, causing Shi Rou's head to violently jerk toward Chen Ping'an. Why are you kowtowing to a small brat like me, Shi Rou? Do you understand etiquette at all? When entering a temple to offer incense, you need to offer it to the bodhisattvas and true gods. When a worshipper enters the scholarly temple or the martial sage temple, will they run to the temple attendant to kowtow to them? If you ask me, I'd say that your brain has gone rotten after living as a ghost for 600 years. Shi Rou started to kowtow even more vigorously, repeating the same lines over and over again. She begged for mercy and asked for them to bestow the immortal body upon her. But Chen Ping'an was not looking at her. He was looking at Cui Dongshan. Back in that secluded alley, neither she nor I mentioned her name. Will you kindly explain to me how you know her name? He suddenly asked. Perchance it was you and the Great Li Empire that secretly planned the calamity that befell the colorful garment nation's Blusher Prefecture? Cui Dongshan's expression immediately froze when he heard this. He had truly gotten carried away this time, so much so that he had actually made such an amateur mistake. By the looks of it, I should stop playing Go with crappy players like Liu Baixiang. It's going to cause my Go skills to fall off a cliff. Cui Dongshan hurriedly stood up and bowed as deeply as he could, explaining, everything was planned by Imperial Preceptor Cui Chan. Please understand, Master. The calamity in Blusher Prefecture had absolutely nothing to do with your disciple. Not a sliver of that event was related to me. Chen Ping'an surprisingly couldn't find any fault in Cui Dongshan's shameless words. He fell silent for a moment before saying in an exasperated voice, You can get up now. Cui Dongshan pretended to wipe the sweat from his forehead in an exaggerated manner. However, upon seeing that Chen Ping'an was actually facing the beautiful skeletal ghost, he could only pause his action and bow deeply again. Shi Rou was unwilling to stand up, and she continued to kowtow to Chen Ping'an again and again. Her sincerity had already transcended words. Chen Ping'an turned to Cui Dongshan and instructed, I'll leave her with you. If it's possible, then help her open the gateway and enter the immortal body. If things don't work out, then there's no need to force yourselves either. Cui Dongshan patted his chest and promised, Rest assured, Master. I guarantee that this will be a profitable transaction, even if things don't succeed in the end. How much compensation should I give you if things succeed then? Chen Ping'an asked with a smile. Cui Dongshan was astonished and he exclaimed, Respecting my master, solving problems for him, and adhering to the Tao are all fundamental responsibilities of a disciple. How could I ask for compensation? Chen Ping'an chuckled and scoffed at him. Do you believe your own words? Cui Dongshan smiled in a bashful manner and replied, Not only are you becoming increasingly knowledgeable, but also more and more emotionally intelligent. To pursue Tao with master, this humble disciple is. Chen Ping'an was forced to raise a hand and halt Cui Dongshan's goosebump-inducing words of flattery. You can stop right about now. Let's be straightforward, okay? Cui Dongshan pondered for a moment before returning to his seat and drinking a sip of tea. He then asked in an uncertain voice, Will you agree to my request if I say that you need to use up all of your gold essence copper coins? Not only that, but the more the better. Chen Ping'an nodded in response. Master, aren't you afraid that fortune and misfortune will come hand in hand? Cui Dongshan asked. What if the female ghost successfully refines and gains control of the immortal body under my guidance, yet I've tampered with things in the process and end up doing something to BT you? Are you willing to trust Cui Dongshan with such a significant responsibility? Chen Ping'an shook his head and replied, It's not that I trust Cui Dongshan. Rather, I trust the master who gave him a second chance. Cui Dongshan fell silent. Meanwhile, Shi Rou was utterly confused by what she was hearing. She was completely clueless about the verbal sparring between the master and the disciple. Cui Dongshan extended a hand and picked up the yellow paper talisman with 2 fingers. At the same time, he summoned Shi Rou back into the talisman and placed everything inside his large snow-white sleeve. One had to realize that Chen Ping'an had already refined and gained ownership of this talisman. The beautiful skeletal ghost was overcome with emotion as she hovered in the intangible void, and she couldn't help but feel increased respect and fear for the young esteemed immortal with a birthmark on his glabella. On the other hand, she felt little fear toward Chen Ping'an, her true master and the person whom she had established a life and death contract with. Her respect for him was also negligible and not worth a mention, because this was the reality of worldly affairs. After putting away the talisman, Cui Dongshan turned to Chen Ping'an and asked, "Master, are you able to stay here for a few more days? It will only be 3 days at most. After that, we'll leave and continue our journey whether we succeed or fail." "That's fine by me," Chen Ping'an replied with a nod. Cui Dongshan felt slightly embarrassed and guilty as he extended a hand toward Chen Ping'an. Chen Ping'an took out several pouches of gold essence copper coins from his pocket treasure. This was the compensation that the Great Li Empire had given him as an apology. He had these coins for only a short time, yet he was already giving them away. Indeed, after Shuro successfully entered the immortal body, she would then become a terrifying, bottomless pit that would need a large number of gold essence copper coins to be filled. Chen Ping'an then took out Du Mao's avatar and allowed Cui Dongshan to put it inside his minimization treasure. Cui Dongshan walked over to the door before stopping and turning around, asking with a smile, "Master, even though I notified you beforehand, are you not angry with how I dealt with those few people?" Chen Ping'an shook his head and replied, "If it doesn't pertain to major issues of principle, then you're free to do as you please." "Then what about Pei Qian?" Chen Ping'an sighed and said, "I can only tell myself that if she stays by my side, I can always catch her mistakes as soon as possible. This is much better than trying to fix the situation after she commits a huge mistake." Cui Dongshan wanted to say something, yet he couldn't help but hesitate. Moreover, he wasn't doing this on purpose to manipulate Chen Ping'an. In the end, he sighed, just like Chen Ping'an, and suggested, "Master, it might help you to read some scriptures written by legalist sages in the short term. After all, using the regulations of etiquette and the moral compass of Confucianism to measure the actions of everyone in the mountains and outside the mountains is far too complicated and exhausting. For example, legalists promote the notion of rulers, officials, leaders, subordinates, nobles, and commoners all abiding by the law. They also promote the idea of not being influenced by relationships and social hierarchy, and using the law to objectively deal with all matters. Both of these notions can be viewed as good strategies to rule over a nation, allowing one to eliminate many unnecessary troubles. Even if you aren't willing to pursue the study of legalism or fully abide by it, using it to pass time and verify the fact that Confucianism is nutritious food while legalism is medicinal food will also be quite beneficial." Chen Ping'an smiled and replied, "That sounds reasonable. Since we're staying in the county city for the next few days, I'll go and look for a few legalist scriptures to read." Cui Dongshan bowed in respect and said in flattery, "Your kindness and ability to listen are very impressive. I have to concede my inferiority to you. Thank you for the valuable lesson. Why don't you compete with Wei Xian and the others to see who's better at flattering people? The 4 of them will definitely admit defeat to you," Chen Ping'an said in exasperation. There was a dazzling smile on Cui Dongshan's face as he closed the door, and he asked, "Master, when you're free in the future, why don't I teach you how to play Go?" Chen Ping'an faltered for a moment before replying, "Let's discuss this later." Cui Dongshan left with a wide smile. The shimmering golden circle on the floor slowly dissipated following Cui Dongshan's exit. Cui Dongshan returned to his room and sat down with his eyes closed. In the end, he solemnly retrieved a picture scroll, one that was surprisingly made from the same material as gold essence copper coins. After Cui Dongshan unfurled the picture scroll on his table, a river of time started to flow, causing numerous images to ripple across the surface of the picture scroll without pause. It was as if the picture scroll housed the most realistic people and matters in the world. The person on the picture scroll was none other than Chen Ping'an. The people and scenes that the picture scroll had extracted from the flow of time largely revolved around Chen Ping'an and Song Jisen, the 2 neighbors in Clay Vase Alley. One pertained to the great Tao of Imperial Preceptor Cui Chan, and one pertained to the future direction of the Great Li Empire. These types of mysterious picture scrolls weaved together using the flow of time were incredibly precious items that immortal forces in the mountains referred to as fleeting glance picture scrolls. Only paramount ascension tier cultivators or powerful immortal tier cultivators, who were adept at certain ancient secret techniques, could use this mystical ability. Sect-level forces with immense foundations and abundant wealth would often use fleeting glance picture scrolls to secretly protect the reincarnations of their grandmasters. They weren't trivial items. They were something that pertained to the cultivation of the great Tao, and also used up an exorbitant amount of resources. All those who possessed such a treasure would cherish it with care. If a person was observed by a fleeting glance picture scroll, all of the fluctuations in their mind's lake would be completely captured by the scroll. These fluctuations would be caused by a person's speech and movements, their decisions and actions, their laughter and tears, the challenges and obstacles they faced, and so on. Even the emperor of the Great Li Empire and Song Jisun's mother, Cui Chan's ally in the beginning, hadn't seen this precious picture scroll before. Cui Dongshan fell deep into thought as he watched Chen Ping'an and Song Jisun slowly grow up, starting as little children and eventually growing up to become young boys. However, his thoughts had already shifted away from the two people in the picture scroll. After Cui Dongshan completed the endgame and stayed in the small town back then, Qi Jingchun had already died and disappeared from the world. However, Cui Dongshan discovered that someone had used a paramount mystical ability to shave a layer off the flowing river of time that corresponded to the jewel's small world. It was extremely subtle, and it was very likely that even immortal tier Qi refiners had failed to notice it, to say nothing of ordinary mortals and earth immortals in the small town. This signified that someone likely possessed a flowing water picture scroll, a type of picture scroll that could capture an even greater period of time than fleeting glance picture scrolls. It was difficult to say who had defied the heavens by doing something like that. It could have potentially been Lu Chan, one of the three branch masters of the Taoist sect, and he might have done this for the sake of Li Shisheng, one of his so-called senior brothers. Otherwise, he might have done this for Long Eyebrows, a descendant of Heavenly Lord Xiesher. It could have been Ruan Xiong, the sage responsible for looking after the small town after Qi Jingchun, and he might have defied the heavens for the sake of his daughter, Ruan Xiu. Of course, it could have also been Old Man Yang from the Yang family's medicine shop, and he might have done this to help Ma Kuxuan, someone who enjoyed profound blessings from the heavens. Alternatively, Old Man Yang might have been secretly gambling on another young prodigy. Cui Dongshan rolled up the fleeting glance picture scroll and carefully put it away in his minimization treasure. He then used his flying sword to draw another circle on the ground, creating a small world that enveloped him and cut him off from the outside world. Only then did he retrieve the yellow paper talisman, the few pouches of gold essence copper coins, and that incredibly valuable immortal body left behind by Du Mao. Cui Dongshan pinched his glabella. Compared to how he had assembled that young boy made out of porcelain in the jewel's small world all those years ago, trying to have Shuro enter and take control of the immortal body would only be more difficult. Cui Dongshan sighed in grief and lamented. It's only reasonable for a disciple to alleviate worries and generously provide funds for their master. Fucking hell, I've gone to seek knowledge under two masters now, yet I've ended up as a pitiful money bag each time. Sure enough, Cui Dongshan and Cui Chan are the same person. Just as Cui Dongshan had suggested, Chen Ping'an visited a few bookstores in the county city to buy 2 legalist classics. He burned the midnight oil to read these classics. During evening the next day, an anxious-looking Cui Dongshan walked into Chen Ping'an's room and complained for a long while. He asked for a pot of osmanthus wine to drink, and then shamelessly asked for another pot of osmanthus wine to take away with him. On the second day, Cui Dongshan had an ashen expression as he shakily walked into Chen Ping'an's room. Pei Qian was earnestly transcribing texts, and Cui Dongshan asked her to shuffle aside before he sat down and sprawled himself across the table. He fell asleep and snored loudly for an entire hour, and when he woke up, he saw Chen Ping'an performing a handstand and practicing the heaven and earth stance. Beside him, Pei Qian was also practicing the 6-step walking meditation. Cui Dongshan silently stood up and left. Of course, he didn't forget to grab the pot of osmanthus wine that was sitting on the table. On the third day, Cui Dongshan announced that they could only leave on the day after tomorrow. He was glowing with exuberance, and he even brought Lu Baixiang's Go set with him when he visited Chen Ping'an. He stated that he was going to teach his master how to play Go, and with how supremely talented Chen Ping'an was, he would definitely surpass Lu Baixiang in just 2 or 3 days. In fact, it was entirely possible for Chen Ping'an to defeat his disciple Cui Dongshan in just 5 or 6 days. Before starting their game of Go, Cui Dongshan became momentarily adrift as he looked at the young man sitting opposite him with an upright posture and a serious expression. Cui Dongshan taught his master the small corner formation from the iridescent Cloud Go manual. No matter how spectacular and powerful this set formation was, and regardless of how it was heralded as a peerless formation by future generations, it was ultimately nothing more than a set formation. However, Chen Ping'an insisted on studying this formation no matter what. In the end, Cui Dongshan spent 2 entire hours explaining the essence and numerous variations of this formation. If Liu Baixiang or any of the Go officials from the Great Li Empire were so stupid, it was very likely that Cui Dongshan would have already unleashed a torrent of abuse at them. In a very rare display, however, Cui Dongshan didn't show an iota of frustration toward Chen Ping'an, most likely due to the fact that Chen Ping'an was his master. Of course, it was also possible that Cui Dongshan was enjoying this moment because his master, who had caused him to suffer so much before, had never sought knowledge from him as earnestly as this before. At any rate, Cui Dongshan taught while Chen Ping'an learned. As the Go stones crisply landed on the Go board one after another, the undulating sounds of their questions and answers slowly reverberated through the room. Late at night on the 4th day, Chen Ping'an's hair instantly stood on end when he opened his door. Goosebumps soon covered his entire body. Standing in front of him was Cui Dongshan, and standing beside his disciple was the blushing Du Mao. She smiled nervously and said in a timid voice, "This humble servant pays respects to master." Chen Ping'an had a huge internal debate with himself before eventually deciding to allow Cui Dongshan and Shi Rou into his room. Just like before, Cui Dongshan used his golden flying sword to draw a large circle around them, blocking out the outside world. Chen Ping'an was very curious, and he couldn't help but ask Cui Dongshan what kind of mystical ability this was. Cui Dongshan smiled and replied that this was an ancient mystical ability wherein one would draw a perimeter and form a prison. This ability could be used to protect those inside the perimeter, and it could also be used to imprison people as well, preventing the targeted people from leaving the area. Later generations had refined this ability and gradually transformed it into several dozen types of immortal techniques. However, most of them had strayed from the correct path and were barely worth a mention. After sitting down, Cui Dongshan was filled with enthusiasm as he talked about Shi Rou, praising her for her impressive aptitude and affinity. He said that apart from using 2 pouches of gold essence copper coins to open the door to the immortal body, everything else had gone relatively smoothly. Thanks to her remarkable determination and great fortune, Shi Rou had genuinely managed to transform the colored glazed golden body of the Ascension Tier Cultivator into a blessed land to house her soul. Even though there was still some tension between Du Mao's immortal body and Shi Rou's soul, it was only a matter of time before this issue would be slowly resolved. Everything had gone well, and there were no longer any major issues. After revealing this big piece of good news, Cui Dongshan started to nitpick on the specifics, saying, "Opening the door and wresting control of the immortal body is only the first step. Shi Rou is uniquely talented, so if someone had recognized her talent earlier and was willing to invest a significant amount of resources into her, it would have been no issue for her to become a first-rate formal god of one of the 5 mountains in the eastern treasured Vile continent." Shi Rou managed to obtain this huge fated opportunity because of her impressive aptitude, but this doesn't necessarily mean that she possesses an equivalently impressive aptitude when it comes to cultivation. In fact, she has failed to advance her cultivation by any noticeable degree after living as a wandering ghost for several hundred years. She failed to become a ghost king or whatever, and apart from her time serving her previous master, it's quite evident that her cultivation talent can't be regarded as exceptional. In other words, the obstacles that lie before Shi Rou are relatively troublesome. She won't be able to overcome the restrictions of this colored glazed golden body, meaning that it will be incredibly difficult for her to take another step forward and achieve genuine control and freedom. Afterward, she only needs to use the most elementary techniques to keep pushing forward. She won't face any big challenges in terms of cultivation, and this is what makes immortal bodies so valuable and coveted. She can advance all the way up to the upper 5 tiers without needing to form a golden core, without needing to nurture a nascent soul, and without needing to pay any heed to internal demons. Who wouldn't be jealous of this? Cui Dongshan chuckled and added, "Of course, you naturally wouldn't be jealous of this with how mentally strong you are." As for me, your disciple, there's no need for me to feel jealous because I already have a similar treasure in my possession. In any case, I'm still inferior to you in this sense, master. No matter how many gold essence copper coins are required for Rose cultivation, I'll always keep 6 coins in my possession. You don't need to think about trying to get these coins from me, Qian Pingyan informed his disciple. Cui Dongshan put on a serious expression and replied, "It's a great honor for those 4 ants from the lotus flower-blessed land to have such a respectful and benevolent master. This is truly a blessing that they've earned over many lifetimes. If they don't understand how to cherish this blessing, however, then they truly deserve to be punished by divine lightning. Please rest assured, master, your disciple is capable of using some abilities pertaining to the 5 lightning righteous technique of Mount Longhu. In fact, I might have greater mastery over these abilities than some ordinary Taoist priests from the Heavenly Master residence. Master, you only need to give me a shout, and I can act on behalf of the heavens and punish those ants at any time." Qian Pingyan shook his head and replied, "I still hope that we can maintain a good relationship with those 4 people even if we eventually part ways." "Master, why aren't you asking me about how you can firmly control Rou after 60 years? Cui Dongshan asked in a quiet voice. Qian Pingyan smiled and replied, "Will you not tell me if I don't ask? When it comes to making transactions and devising schemes, I concede that I'm far inferior to you. However, I believe in you, and I further believe that you won't act sneakily beyond the path of the great Tao. Otherwise, I would be underestimating you far too much." Cui Dongshan was almost moved to tears and he exclaimed, "Who would have thought that I've already become such a considerate person in my master's mind? Since you are willing to believe in me, how can I not serve you with utmost loyalty, even if it means marching into death?" Qian Pingyan glanced at Rou, the beautiful skeletal ghost who was about to travel around the world inside Du Mao's immortal body. "Do you regret this?" he asked. Rou smiled and replied, "Master, you might not understand the myriad of pains that entities have to face. We hear the spring thunder, we hear the ringing of bells at dawn, we hear the beating of drums at dusk, we feel the true astral wind sweeping through the world, we feel the incisiveness of the autumn gusts, we feel the murderous auras on the battlefields, we're affected by the shrines and temples of the deities, and there's so much more. All of these things are like torture for wandering ghosts like me. Moreover, it's very easy for us to lose our final shred of sentience, and devolve into a malicious ghost that knows nothing but slaughter." Rou talked tirelessly, explaining the many rules and secrets that pertain to entities in the world. Qian Pingyan listened carefully, and only after this did he feel slightly less uncomfortable when facing Rou's current form. Cui Dongshan had a faint smile the entire time, and he also listened to Rou's explanations alongside Qian Pingyan. With Rou successfully entering Du Mao's colored glaze golden body and seizing control of it, it could be said that this matter had essentially come to a successful end. Cui Dongshan simply said that they needed to rest and recuperate for another day. Qian Pingyan nodded and agreed to his request. Right now, it seemed like they were holding a celebratory banquet in Qian Pingyan's room. However, it was simply the case that the 3 people involved in the matter were each enjoying a pot of osmanthus wine. After a while, Cui Dongshan stood up and bid farewell. Qian Pingyan saw the 2 of them off, and after closing the door, the young boy in white and the old man with white hair walked one behind another in the corridor outside. Even though there was delight on Cui Dongshan's face, Rou couldn't help but feel increasingly uneasy and afraid for some unknown reason. Sure enough, Cui Dongshan immediately grabbed Du Mao's head with a vice-like grip upon arriving in his room, pushing Rou into the wall and lambasting her. "You're a measly entity that's even lesser than an ant, yet you actually dared to spout so much nonsense in front of my master. Who gave you the courage?" Du Mao's colored glazed golden body was at the immortal tier, and was no weaker than the powerful physiques of 9th-tier martial artists. So logically speaking, Cui Dongshan's action should have been nothing more than a tickle for Rou, especially since he was only an earth immortal. However, Cui Dongshan had clearly used some kind of secret mystical ability, and Rou's soul trembling as if 5 powerful gusts of astral winds were lashing its foundations. Rou's aged face twisted in agony, and tears of pain streamed down. Cui Dongshan raised his other hand and flicked Rou's forehead, causing a deafening sound to ring through her soul, as if a gigantic bell were being struck right beside her ear. He eventually let go, and Shuro collapsed into a shivering heap on the ground, with her body drenched in sweat. Cui Dongshan stomped on her forehead, causing the back of her head to violently slam into the wall. He then bent over to peer down at her, jeering. Your abilities fail to match your virtue, and your virtues fail to match your position. You failed in both of these areas. So do you believe me when I say that I'll drag your soul out from this immortal body and force you to suffer the wrath of that righteous wind and cleansing rain every day? Otherwise, I might as well treat this immortal body as a lantern and your soul as a candle wick. You might not notice anything untoward, but you'll suddenly die a violent death in 60 years. He put even more weight behind his foot, causing Shuro's head to slowly fracture the wall behind her. His gaze was ice cold. What's wrong? You've forgotten who you are and become all high and mighty simply because of that little wiener in your pants. Shuro's expression suddenly changed, with the fear in her eyes transforming into apathy. Even though she was suffering immense pain and humiliation, she still raised her head and looked Cui Dongshan in the eyes for the first time. Cui Dongshan found this very interesting, and he smiled faintly and said in an amused voice, You're a remnant member of a nation that was destroyed 600 years ago. And you're also a remnant member of that Taoist side branch that's already been wiped from the world. Yet, after suffering so much pain to survive until today, this is the limit of your patience and tolerance? You even dare to play this game of go with me now? Asked about Tao, one replies, an appearance like a haggard skeleton, a heart like extinguished ashes. How about it? Have I managed to uncover your true identity now? Perhaps I should act as that person asking about Tao, and use the unique secret technique created by the rejuvenation ancestor of your side branch to comprehensively annihilate the last remaining specks of your side branch. There was utter disbelief on Shuro's face as she stared at Cui Dongshan, and an expression of uncontrollable fear finally spread across her face. This was a sense of fear greater than the fear of death. Shuro had once sat on a stone tablet inside a city god temple in the colorful garment nation, and she had softly hummed a tune that Chan Pingan had mistaken for an ancient ballad from the nation. She had initially thought that no one would be aware of these secrets anymore, especially since they were ancient matters from hundreds of years ago that had already been destroyed and buried by an alliance of many forces in the eastern treasured vile continent. Moreover, even if someone had coincidentally come across scattered verses of this ballad in some damaged ancient text, how could they possibly determine her true identity from just this alone? How could they find the true weak point of a measly ghost like her? Cui Dongshan extended 2 fingers, causing a golden flying sword to shoot out from his glabella and fly around his fingers. In the end, the flying sword surprisingly drew a long-lost golden talisman in the air. It was as if a dignified golden lotus were blooming from the tips of Cui Dongshan's fingers. Shuro wanted to open her mouth and beg for mercy, yet she realized that she couldn't make a sound no matter how hard she struggled. She could only watch on helplessly as that person's finger continued to move toward her glabella. Shuro closed her eyes, with her lips moving slightly as she silently sang the opening ballad of that Taoist side branch that she had once belonged to. She was prepared to die, yet she discovered that Cui Dongshan had already retracted his hand when she slowly opened her eyes. He was looking her up and down with an expression of pity. Cui Dongshan straightened his back and rubbed the sole of his shoe against Shuro's face for a bit. It was as if he were cleaning his shoe after stepping in a puddle of mud. He shot a glance at Shuro, who had just escaped from the brink of death, and warned, "This better not happen again." Shuro nodded softly in response. Cui Dongshan had only just taken a few steps forward, yet he suddenly turned around and violently stomped on Shuro's head, causing it to sink more than halfway into the wall. His expression was furious as he roared, "I spared your life, yet you're not even going to thank me?" Shuro pulled her head out from the wall before falling to her knees and silently kowtowing 3 times to Cui Dongshan. Cui Dongshan sat down beside the table and snapped, "I won't follow master around the entire time, so remember not to waste this sturdy body of yours after I leave. If my master becomes injured because you failed to fight with your full strength, then I'll extract that speck of Tao seed from the depths of your soul regardless of how minor or severe my master's injuries are. I'll then plant the Tao seed into the body of a Buddhist monk." Shuro slowly raised her head, and there was deep anguish and pain on her face as she looked at Cui Dongshan. He looked like an ethereal immortal, yet his mind was cold, cruel, and calculating. How can there be someone as terrifying as you in the world? She murmured. Cui Dongshan sniggered and said, It wasn't Master who taught me this. Rather, I mastered this by myself. Shuro stood up, and she only dared to stand near the wall. Cui Dongshan slammed the table with his hand and exclaimed, Are you not going to piss off back to your own room? Are you staying here to seek death? Do you believe me when I say that I'll chop off the wiener between your legs and force you to eat it? The grief-stricken Shuro lowered her head and hurriedly walked out of the room that was much like hell on earth. Cui Dongshan flipped open the books written by literati from the Azure Phoenix Nation, and the more he read the angrier he became. He slammed the books shut and cursed. What complete bullshit that saying is. Your speech will become drab, and your appearance will become detestable if you don't read for 3 days? Reading this nonsense is like having someone smear a big pile of shit all over my face. Not only that, but it's fucking diarrhea as well. Cui Dongshan couldn't fall asleep, and this made him feel incredibly bored. Thus, he quietly left the inn and went to wander around in the county city. Cui Dongshan inadvertently came across an impoverished vagrant cultivator at the lower 5 tiers who was using a lowly stealing technique. He was controlling a dozen or so small ghosts and spirits, and using them to steal money from an ordinary family in the county city. Like ants moving nests, the small ghosts and spirits worked together to carry the copper coins and loose silver. Meanwhile, the vagrant cultivator was squatting at the foot of the wall and smiling widely as he weighed the 2 or 3 largest pieces of silver in his hand. Little by little, the copper coins and loose silver would add up to a sum that was no longer little. When he turned around, however, he was shocked to discover a young boy in white squatting beside him and, seemingly enjoying the moon with him. The vagrant cultivator shivered in fright. Cui Dongshan smiled with squinted eyes and asked, You can actually bring yourself to do this? Why don't you steal from wealthier families? The vagrant cultivator gulped and replied in fear and unease, Because the door gods of those wealthier families are truly far too difficult to deal with. I'll end up losing money if the money-moving ghosts and spirits that I've raised through so much hard work are killed by the door gods. Cui Dongshan nodded and said, That makes sense. The eyes of the vagrant cultivator darted around as he considered how he should escape. Should he kill the strange young boy squatting behind him? However, was this worth it for the sake of a few taels of silver? Moreover, heavens knew who would end up killing whom. Cui Dongshan extended 2 fingers and pinched up a small money-moving ghost that was only as tall as a thumb. He then placed it in his palm and held his hands together, chaotically rubbing it around. The eyelids of the vagrant cultivator twitched when he saw this. While the vagrant cultivator was feeling absolute heartache, Cui Dongshan spread his hands apart to reveal the grimacing little money-moving ghost that looked like it was now wearing an additional layer of red clothes. Cui Dongshan tossed the ghost to the ground and commanded, Go, head over to a wealthy family and steal a block of gold for me. The small ghost clenched its hands into fists and puffed its cheeks up as it earnestly ran into the distance. Approximately 15 minutes later, the small ghost actually returned with a piece of gold the size of a fingernail. The vagrant cultivator was stunned, and he hurriedly cupped his fists in respect when he eventually came to his senses, saying, Esteemed immortal, your profound mystical abilities are truly an eye-opener for me. Cui Dongshan stood up and disappeared in a flash, leaving behind a vagrant cultivator who was beside himself with excitement. Cui Dongshan visited the scholarly temple and the martial sage temple in the county city, yet he couldn't stand the excessive respect that he was shown in both temples. He quickly took his leave after making some brief small talk. However, he still felt very bored, so he chose the colorful door gods of some random family to bless with his mystical abilities. He elevated the level of the 2 door gods, giving them the ability to form godly bodies in the future. They were still miles and miles away from becoming genuine deities, and they could only frighten some of the weakest and most useless entities and block out a bit more murderous aura, but it was still a great blessing for them. Afterward, he visited the second wealthiest clan in the county city and snapped off the mystical beasts on the roof ridges one by one, casually tossing them to the ground. He wandered around aimlessly, and he followed his heart and did as he pleased. To have an earth immortal become as bored as this, Cui Dongshan was truly one of a kind. It was already nighttime when Cui Dongshan left Chen Pingan's room with Shuro, and Chen Pingan walked out of his room and headed next door after practicing the heaven and earth stance for a while. He knocked on the door lightly and asked with an angry chuckle. "It's already so late, yet you're still awake?" Pei Qian had lit the oil lamp and was reading a novel about a wandering martial artist that she had obtained recently, and she hurriedly extinguished the lamp when she heard Chan Ping'an knocking and quickly leaped into bed. She pretended that she had just been woken up and she replied, "Huh? I was sleeping. Why haven't you gone to sleep yet, master? Do you want me to open the door?" Chan Ping'an chuckled and didn't make a fuss about Pei Qian lying. Instead, he said in reminder, "There's no need to open the door. You can read whenever you want, so make sure not to strain your eyes too much. We're staying here for another day tomorrow, so you can continue to read in the morning." Chan Ping'an turned around to leave, yet another thought popped into his mind at this moment. He turned back and said through the door, "After I leave, don't light the oil lamp and hide in your blanket to read." Pei Qian's jaw dropped to the ground when she heard this. Her master was truly very impressive. He could even read her mind. She had no option but to reply, "Okay, I understand." After Chan Ping'an left, Pei Qian was still itching to read the novel and dive into all of the intense fights and complicated relationships. However, she resisted her urge and remained in bed. Her eyes were wide open, and she didn't feel sleepy at all. Only after a long time did she finally become drowsy and fall asleep. The next day, Cui Dongshan went to Chan Ping'an's room to teach him Go after they finished eating breakfast. The two of them were still focusing on that small corner formation from the iridescent Cloud Go manual. Lu Baixiang was the first person to walk over and spectate their exchange, and he immediately became engrossed by what he saw. In the end, he found a brief moment of respite to hurriedly walk away and call Sui Yubian over to watch the lesson with him. He told her that things were indescribably wonderful. When playing Go with Lu Baixiang before, Sui Yubian had once faced Lu Baixiang's small corner formation in the early game and been completely obliterated. However, she had refused to accept this outcome, and she had allowed Lu Baixiang to use the same set formation 3 games in a row. In the end, she had lost the early advantage in all 3 games and suffered resounding defeats. In fact, she had even made an exception and played some random and seemingly unreasonable moves, yet it had still been insufficient for her to wrest back control. Thus, Sui Yubian's interest was slightly piqued when she heard Lu Baixiang claim that he had only comprehended 30 to 40% of the small corner set formation. This caused her to follow Lu Baixiang and walk into Chan Ping'an's room. She wanted to see how Cui Dongshan taught Go, and she also wanted to see how Chan Ping'an learned Go. It wasn't long before Zhu Lian also came over to join in on the fun. Wei Xian was the last of the 4 martial artists to enter Chan Ping'an's room. However, it only took a short while for Sui Yubian to lose interest in the lesson. Chan Ping'an's talent in Go was far too ordinary, and someone as slow as him wouldn't be able to improve by any noticeable amount regardless of how divinely skilled Cui Dongshan was at teaching. It was inevitable for Sui Yubian, who was already masterful at Go, to feel anxious and bored at the same time. In the end, she silently walked away. While leaving, she couldn't help but steal a few glances at the old man who was sitting behind Cui Dongshan, having a nagging feeling that there was something strange and awkward about him. Why did she feel like he was an old sissy who was even more revolting than Zhu Lian? He was an old man, yet he didn't dare to catch the gazes of other people. Not only that, but he even liked to purse his lips and tug at the hems of his clothes with orchid fingers. 1. Zhu Lian and Wei Xian also left one after another following Sui Yubian's departure. The battlefields in Old Dragon City had been isolated, so the 4 martial artists from the picture scrolls had never actually seen Du Mao. They had also never seen Shiro, the beautiful skeletal ghost, since she had been held in the yellow paper talisman. As a result, Sui Yubian and the others were all taken by surprise when they saw Du Mao's immortal body suddenly appear among them. However, they simply viewed the old man as an outsider whom Cui Dongshan had randomly picked up who knew where. Cui Dongshan locked himself in his room after lunch. The next morning, Chan Ping'an and the others set off again, heading toward the capital of the Azure Phoenix Nation. The yellow earth bull had initially been very eye-catching. After Cui Dongshan jumped on its back, it was still very eye-catching, but much less so than before. The passers-by who saw this simply speculated that the handsome young boy in white hailed from a wealthy clan and was traveling around the cultivation world with his subordinates. His choices of mount and subordinates were indeed somewhat strange, but he appeared very carefree and quite elegant for his age. With Cui Dongshan present, their trip to the capital of the Azure Phoenix Nation became slightly more relaxed and casual. The four martial artists from the picture scrolls ruminated over this and each understood some things. If Chen Ping'an had become livelier and less serious after meeting his two friends, Zhang Shanfeng and Su Yuanxia, then it could be said that he had become carefree within reasonable limits after reuniting with his disciple. Even though the relationship between them didn't conform to the typical relationships between masters and disciples, it was undoubtedly the case that Cui Dongshan's arrival had lifted some weight off Chen Ping'an's shoulders. Moreover, even though Chen Ping'an was the master and Cui Dongshan was the disciple, the former was also asking the latter about legalist principles while learning Go from him. As they traveled, Cui Dongshan always insisted on paying, and he refused to let his master spend a single copper coin. Listening to the casual conversations between Cui Dongshan and Chen Ping'an, the four martial artists from the picture scrolls were also able to gain a deeper and more complete understanding of the majestic world. For example, Liu Baixiang learned that apart from attaining Tao or reaching the end tier of martial arts in this world that was filled with all kinds of unique and wonderful things, there were also Confucians who genuinely focused all of their time and effort on seeking knowledge and self-cultivation. There were also many Qi refiners who belonged to the 100 schools of thought, and there were spiritual masters who prioritized the teachings of their Taoist orthodoxy over the level of their cultivation bases. Sui Yubian witnessed the strange and peculiar immortal techniques used by Cui Dongshan, and she learned how these techniques could be flawlessly used to one's advantage in everyday life. Zhu Lian approached Cui Dongshan twice when there was no one else around. His thinking was very simple, and he only wanted to confirm how many immortal treasures this person actually possessed. Meanwhile, Wei Xian was still the quietest and most taciturn of the four people. He got along best with Pei Qian, and the two of them would often speak to each other with no sense of appropriate respect or seniority. Just like that time when Cui Dongshan and Chen Ping'an had left the capital of the Great Sui Nation and traveled together, Cui Dongshan would occasionally disappear from time to time and Chen Ping'an would never ask about his whereabouts. Shi Rou, the old man in the eyes of Sui Yubian and the others, finally appeared less like a sissy than before. He no longer swayed his hips like a woman, and there was no longer a watery and effeminate look in his eyes. He also stopped making orchid fingers subconsciously, and he finally appeared like a normal old man. Even so, Shi Rou was still the most disliked member of the entire group. In fact, her standing was even inferior to that of the yellow earth bull. Pei Qian was relatively diligent when she practiced the white ape sword-carrying technique and the white ape saber-wielding technique. These were just stances anyway, and they were quite impressive and mighty-looking. Pei Qian didn't need to suffer any excruciating pain when practicing them, and compared to the six-step walking meditation, she much preferred to use the bamboo sword and bamboo saber that Chen Ping'an had made her to practice these techniques she had learned from Taoist nun Huang Ting. One time, however, Cui Dongshan was sitting cross-legged on the earth bull and mocked Pei Qian. He brutally disparaged her sword-carrying technique, ridiculing it as completely useless. Cui Dongshan clutched his belly and roared with laughter, laughing so hard that he fell off the back of the earth bull. This severely dented Pei Qian's confidence and caused her to become depressed for several days. During this time, she only dared to practice walking meditation every day. After traveling for a few more days, they arrived at the prefectural city closest to the capital of the Azure Phoenix Nation. Cui Dongshan somehow managed to find a tranquil immortal inn, the bustling prefectural city for them to stay in. Chen Ping'an genuinely lacked talent when it came to playing Go, yet he didn't toss it aside because of this. At the same time, he didn't force himself to keep playing and improving either. He spent approximately 2 hours learning Go from Cui Dongshan every day, and this wouldn't affect him practicing his fist techniques or sword techniques. Arriving at the immortal inn called the 100 Flower Garden, Chen Ping'an learned that the innkeeper was a sea observation tier cultivator who looked like a middle-aged man. However, the innkeeper didn't appear in front of Cui Dongshan and the others. The 100 Flower Garden occupied a fairly large area in the prefectural city, and there were all kinds of peculiar and wonderful flowers and plants decorating the inn and refreshing one's mind and body. Because the grand debate between Buddhism and Taoism was about to begin in the capital nearby, there were few spare rooms remaining in this immortal inn located in the prefectural city closest to the capital. Pei Qian once again shared a room with Sui Yubian, while Lu Baixiang, Zhu Lian, and Wei Xian all squeezed into one room. Cui Dongshan, Shi Rou, and Qian Ping'an were the only people who enjoyed an entire room to themselves. Staying in the 100-flower garden was very expensive, but Qian Ping'an and the others were indeed getting what they paid for. There were many benefits that money couldn't buy. For example, they could get interesting insider knowledge about the immortals in the mountains and how they were reacting to the imminent debate between Buddhism and Taoism. The 100-flower inn would collate this information into something that looked like an official government report and deliver it to the guests each day. Apart from this, each room in the inn was equipped with several nifty spirit tools. Well, even though they were spirit tools, they were crafted from scrap pieces and worth a total of 2 or 3 snowflake coins. In any case, guests were free to take these spirit tools with them when they left. Pei Qian was overjoyed when she learned of this. She started to flatter Sui Yubian, and after obtaining the small spirit tools in their room, she ran over to Old Man Wei and Little Bai's room to treat them to some roasted seeds and fruit. She dawdled around for a long time, and she refused to leave no matter what. In the end, Zhu Lian was the one who became so annoyed that he told Pei Qian to hurry up and take the trinkets and leave. In the end, with the addition of the 4 spirit tools from Qian Ping'an's room, Pei Qian managed to gather 10 low-grade spirit tools. Cultivators at the middle 5 tiers wouldn't care about attractive but useless spirit tools like these, while those at the lower 5 tiers couldn't afford to stay at inns to begin with. As a result, Pei Qian became filthy rich in a single night. Her treasure box could no longer house so many treasures, so she could only leave them in Qian Ping'an's minimization treasure for the moment. This was an inn for powerful esteemed immortals, so the atmosphere of the inn was naturally calm and peaceful. Moreover, after forging a good relationship with the local government, the 100-flower inn was allowed to set up a formation that could gather spiritual energy from the wind and water, allowing the spiritual energy in the inn to be far more abundant than the spiritual energy in the prefectural city outside. In addition to this, there were also 2 colorful door gods plastered on the front doors of the inn. They were genuine talismanic door gods, and divine warriors suited in golden armor would step out if sinister entities dared to approach them, wielding weapons and capable of vanquishing ghosts. Apart from this, the inn would also provide guests with a small plate of immortal fruit every day. These were the best and freshest produce of an agrarian cultivator in the 100-flower garden, and they were one of the main drawing points of the inn. While transcribing texts, Pei Qian paused and put her calligraphy brush down several times. When she rotated her wrists to loosen them up, she would always see Qian Ping'an staring at the plate of jujubes in pairs in a daze. It seemed like her master was being reminded of something unhappy. When Pei Qian finished transcribing texts, she discovered that Qian Ping'an was still sitting in the same spot as before. It was just that he was looking out the window now. Pei Qian was slightly worried, so she joked, "What's wrong, master? Are you thinking about the mistress?" Qian Ping'an came to his senses and replied with a faint smile, "Do you want to transcribe another 500 characters?" Pei Qian furrowed her brows with a pained expression. Qian Ping'an stood up and patted Pei Qian's head. He then started to walk around the table and practiced the 6-step walking meditation. Pei Qian felt increasingly puzzled. Qian Ping'an would usually practice the heaven and earth stance that combined all 3 stances together now, and he would seldom practice this simple and elementary fist stance alone. Pei Qian tidied up the paper and the calligraphy brush and put them away. She then rested her arms and head on the table and casually asked, "Master, were you never afraid of ghosts and fiends ever since you were little?" As Qian Ping'an slowly practiced walking meditation and walked around the table, he replied, "I was a bit different from you. I stopped being afraid of ghosts at a very young age, and I even wished that there were truly ghosts in the world. I would often go to an immortal tomb located outside my hometown by myself. When I became a bit older, I needed to enter the mountains to collect firewood or venture out by myself to search for suitable clay to make porcelain. I was never afraid of ghosts and fiends during that time." "Wow! Master is truly so amazing," Pei Qian exclaimed. Qian Ping'an simply responded with a smile, not explaining the reasons behind this. Noon arrived, and the 100-flower inn delivered to them another report about immortals in the mountains. There were all kinds of different information in the report, and there was one specific item that interested Qian Ping'an the most. After his session of Go with Cui Dongshan, he asked his disciple for his thoughts. While marching north with troops, Chief Military Governor Wei Liang had passed a provincial city. Due to a minor matter there, the chief military governor had caught 2 officials who were accused of dereliction of their duties. One was a general who was accused of corruption and perversion of law, having accepted more than 100,000 taels of silver in bribes. The other was a scholarly official who had twisted facts with his calligraphy brush. However, the former had only been demoted and banished, while the latter had been directly executed. Without needing to ponder over this question, Cui Dongshan immediately replied, "This is how legalists deal with problems. Oftentimes, people will view the latter as having committed a lesser crime than the former. However, legalists are the opposite, and they insist on upgrading the severity of the latter crime." Cui Dongshan smiled and asked, "Master, do you understand the reason now?" Chen Ping'an fell deep into thought. After a while he sighed with emotion and remarked, "How impressive." Cui Dongshan casually continued, "To exist for 1,000 years without fading into obscurity, the 100 schools of thought that exist beyond the 3 teachings naturally possess solid foundations and distinctive qualities. Thus, a certain person already made this remark a long time ago. Life is limited while knowledge is unlimited. To pursue that which is unlimited with that which is limited, such is a tiresome task indeed. Mortals are fond of the first half of the saying, while cultivators will appreciate the second half of the saying. To put it simply, a cultivator can spend their entire life studying a single teaching or a single school of thought, yet they still won't dare to claim that they've comprehensively studied everything and reached the end of the teaching. With this in mind, one needs to make trade-offs when deciding what to study. When considering what to study, one has to examine whether one can genuinely transform the knowledge into one's own knowledge. When considering what not to study, one has to examine whether they're picking up the trivial and discarding the profound. Chen Ping'an nodded in response. Cui Dongshan grabbed a pear and took a bite, continuing in a muffled voice. However, knowledge is knowledge and human conduct is human conduct. There are some links between the two, yet there are no definitive links between the two. It's because of this that worldly matters are so complicated, no? It comes down to a person's destiny and karmic fate regarding how they live, what books they read, and whether the books they read are beneficial. There are far too many fools in the world, and they fail to understand that the primary goal of reading is to better understand the world. These fools are completely trashing the sincere words and teachings of the sages. When sages impart their knowledge, the scriptures that get created are like lanterns that hang in the night sky. These lanterns illuminate different paths, and each lantern is different in size and brightness from the one next to it. Yet it's a shame that most people in the world are decidedly blind. Chen Ping'an offered no response to this. Cui Dongshan was simply making conversation to stave off boredom, so he quickly changed the topic and started to talk about little Baoping's glorious feats. At the end of last year, Li Huai, the little fool, had gotten into an argument with a classmate of his. The classmate had snatched away a book that the academy had only just given to Li Huai, claiming that it was his. However, Li Baoping was coincidentally walking past, and she had immediately settled the argument between them. After taking the book, she had told Li Huai and his classmate that she might as well tear the book in half and give them a half each, since it was impossible to determine the true owner. The other child had happily agreed to this solution, and thus Li Baoping had tossed the book to Li Huai and viciously beat up the other child. Standing in the distance, an old scholar had watched on and laughed heartily upon seeing Li Baoping's solution. Li Huai's classmate didn't know where he had gone wrong, so he sobbed and ran to the old scholar to cry about the injustice. In the end, he was rewarded with another session of physical punishment by the old scholar. Chen Ping'an laughed in amusement. Pei Qian was also sitting there and listening, and she sighed. The person who stole the book was far too stupid. Sure enough, there are far too many fools in the world. This can't be helped. Chen Ping'an immediately rewarded her with a knuckle to the forehead and scolded. The important issue isn't whether he was stupid or not. Rather, he was wrong to steal the book in the first place. If he stole the book and was smart enough to escape punishment, then that's even more wrong. I didn't say stealing was right, Pei Qian moaned in an aggrieved voice. Cui Dongshan smiled and said, "This world is never short on people who are both stupid and sinister, and this type of people can't be educated by Confucian knowledge." Pei Qian wholeheartedly agreed with this, and she nodded and said, "The legalists that you mentioned just then are quite impressive. They appear to be very effective against bad people. However, Pei Qian immediately covered her mouth after saying this, afraid that Chen Pingyan would get angry at her. It's not wrong for you to think right now, Chen Pingyan said with a smile. However, you still need to read more books. You shouldn't feel like you already have all of the correct answers now. Pei Qian thought for a moment before replying, then Confucianism is still better. It was already tiring enough for her to transcribe that Confucian classic right now, so wouldn't she be seeking torture for herself if she were made to transcribe an additional legalist scripture? Cui Dongshan raised a thumb and remarked, "Sure enough, you're just as unyielding as Zhu Lian said." Pei Qian pretended that she couldn't hear this. Cui Dongshan chuckled and asked, "Pei Qian, you have a fairly good relationship with Wei Xian, right?" Pei Qian immediately became alert, and she replied with a smile, "Our relationship is only a so-so." "Oh ho, such flimsy convictions. How very lively!" Cui Dongshan exclaimed. Pei Qian rolled her eyes. Cui Dongshan would continue to offer words of flattery to her master, yet he only knew how to spew absolute nonsense in front of her. He wouldn't offer her a single word of praise. This person was truly very detestable. If Cui Dongshan angered her master one day, and if she, the opening disciple, had mastered her peerless sword techniques and saber techniques at that time, then she would copy those gallant heroes in the martial arts novels. She would clean out the sect for her master. Cui Dongshan was like a mind-reading parasite in Pei Qian's brain, and he chuckled. "What, you want to find an opportunity to fight with me in the future with those pathetic sword and saber techniques of yours? What are you talking about?" Pei Qian asked with a baffled expression. Cui Dongshan grabbed a jujube from the plate and gently threw it at Pei Qian's forehead, saying, "TSK, trying to compete with me, little one?" Pei Qian caught the falling jujube and feigned throwing it back. However, Cui Dongshan remained unfazed and unmoving. Pei Qian feigned throwing the jujube back several times, yet Cui Dongshan simply smiled and remained still. Pei Qian felt like she most likely wouldn't be able to hit him. Even if she were lucky enough to hit him, she would most probably end up suffering more than him in the long run. With this in mind, Pei Qian stuffed the jujube into her mouth and shot an angry glare at Cui Dongshan. A look of panic suddenly appeared on Cui Dongshan's face and he exclaimed, "Not good. This jujube is a descendant of the jujube tree spirit in the 100-flower garden, and cultivators like me naturally don't need to be afraid of tree spirits trying to attack us. But you're only a little child, so that tree spirit will definitely look for the weakest person among us to attack. Before you go to bed at night, make sure that you close all of the windows and doors. Otherwise, it will be really frightening if an army of branches crawls into your room in the middle of the night." While speaking, Cui Dongshan waved his arms around and pretended to be a tree spirit sneaking into someone's room to harm them. Pei Qian was terrified, and she immediately grabbed her favorite talisman and forcefully slapped it onto her forehead. She then crossed her arms. Cui Dongshan sighed and lamented, "This isn't enough. Your talisman is a treasure pagoda demon-suppressing talisman, and it's ineffective against tree spirits 1. Hearing this, Pei Qian retrieved the Yang Energy Illumination talisman that Chen Pingyan had given her much later, and also stuck it on her forehead. Cui Dongshan raised his hands and said in worry, "Don't. This talisman is a guiding talisman, and it's not able to resist ghosts and spirits either. If anything, it might have the opposite effect and attract the attention of other tree spirits instead. They'll feel like you're provoking them, and an entire army of tree spirits and flower spirits will march to your room alongside the jujube tree spirit. At that time there'll be spirits all around your bed and all under it as well." Pei Qian pursed her lips and puckered up her tanned face. Tears also started to well up in her eyes. Chen Pingyan smacked the back of Cui Dongshan's head and scolded him with a smile. "Stop trying to frighten her." Cui Dongshan replied with a nod before clutching his belly with one hand and pointing at Pei Qian with his other. "Ha ha ha, what a little idiot." Pei Qian's embarrassment transformed into anger, and she was just about to run next door to retrieve her hiking pole. After all, she felt like her self-created deranged demon sword techniques was her mightiest technique right now. She was going to fight him to the death. Seeing the situation take a turn for the worse, Cui Dongshan immediately stood up and slipped away. After Cui Dongshan ran away, Pei Qian squeezed out a smile and said to Chen Pingyan, "Master, I was only pretending to be scared just then. Even if I don't have the 2 talismans, I'll still recite those sagely classics every night before I go to bed." That way, I can definitely resist all evil and deter all ghosts and spirits, right? Qian Ping'an looked at the skinny little girl who still had 2 talismans stuck on her forehead, and he forcefully suppressed his laughter and replied with a nod. Perhaps. Only perhaps? Pei Qian exclaimed in a flustered voice. Qian Ping'an smiled and said, "This is an immortal inn, so how can there be ghosts and spirits that dare to harm people? What if there are?" Pei Qian asked with a pitiful expression. Qian Ping'an faltered for a moment before patting her head and replying, "Don't worry, aren't I next door to you? What is there to be afraid of?" Pei Qian's eyes lit up, and she immediately removed the talismans from her forehead and placed them back inside her sleeve. She then ran over to the window and stood on her tippy toes, muttering something to the garden outside. It was without a doubt that she was saying something naive like, "My master is Qian Ping'an, so let's keep out of each other's way." Elsewhere in the inn, Sui Yubian actively sought out Cui Dongshan and asked, "Do you have secret techniques for nurturing flying swords?" Cui Dongshan smiled and didn't say anything. "Do you want something in exchange?" Sui Yubian directly asked. Cui Dongshan sat down beside the table and looked at the beautiful woman standing at the door with a sword strapped to her back. He smiled faintly and replied, "My ask is very simple. Don't forget your roots." Sui Yubian frowned and asked, "Care to elaborate?" There was a look of disdain on Cui Dongshan's face as he waved a hand to shoo her away. "You can't even understand this, yet you still dare to dream about nurturing a bonded flying sword as a pure martial artist?" Sui Yubian's expression became ice-cold as she turned around and walked away. Cui Dongshan paid no heed to this, and he pondered for a moment before walking to Wei Xian's room. Zhu Lian was strolling around the 100-flower garden, meaning that he was coincidentally away from the room that he was sharing with Lu Baixiang and Wei Xian. The door of the room wasn't locked either, so Cui Dongshan directly pushed open the door and entered. Cui Dongshan casually strolled into the room, after which the door automatically closed by itself. Cui Dongshan extended a hand and gently clenched it into a fist, replying, "You, Wei Xian, are someone who doesn't care about the process and only cares about the results. You're the worst Go player. Yet you've inadvertently become the closest to the core principles of Go at the same time. There will eventually come a day when your fist will smash into my master's weak point. That being the case, why don't I kill you first? Why don't I kill you right here and right now? One can always trump up a charge against someone," Wei Xian replied in a calm voice. Cui Dongshan flicked his sleeve, causing a picture scroll to land on the table beside Wei Xian. There were also 3 gold essence copper coins. Cui Dongshan strode forward, with one hand clasped behind his back and one hand clenched into a fist. "If I kill you by mistake, then I kill you by mistake. I'll kill you until your cultivation base can't fall any lower. When my master makes a full recovery from his injuries and subsequently breaks through to the next tier, you'll already be too weak to harm my master even if you want to." Wei Xian chuckled coldly and said, "Then let's see whether my cultivation base falls lower or whether you suffer more after being disowned by your master. Do you truly think I'm unaware that this picture scroll is nothing more than an illusion technique that you, Cui Dongshan, have set up? Just what kind of person is Qian Ping'an? I'm sure that you know as well as I do." Cui Dongshan was slightly surprised and he slowed down and remarked, "I underestimated you. You're the founding emperor of the Southern Garden Nation, after all. Go on, tell me about it. You, Wei Xian, are the true threat among the 4 people, so why have you waited for so long and been unwilling to act? I'm very curious. Is it because of Pei Qian?" Wei Xian was expressionless, and he didn't respond to Cui Dongshan's question. Cui Dongshan smiled and sat down, continuing, "While playing Go with Master and helping him review the games, I asked him everything about the Lotus Flower-blessed land, regardless of how significant or minor the matter was. Regarding the backgrounds of you and the others from the picture scrolls, I know everything about you that Master knows. Master didn't notice the subtle clues, but I paid very close attention to them." Cui Dongshan pointed at an unofficial history book on the table and explained, "For example, according to the unofficial history books written by later generations in the Southern Garden Nation, their iron-fisted founding emperor was the fondest of his young daughter who died at a very young age. In fact, for the sake of this young daughter, he even dispatched all of the scholars from the palace to search for immortals in the mountains to revive her." "Wei Xian, in your eyes, how similar is Pei Qian to your daughter?" Will you be able to revive your daughter in the lotus flower-blessed land if you kill Chan Ping'an? Or perhaps you can have her attach herself to Pei Qian's body. That way, you can reunite with your daughter in the majestic world? And perhaps you Wei Xian will still die, but at least your daughter can live again, right? As for whether she lives in the Southern Garden Nation or somewhere, that doesn't matter anymore, does it? After all of her relatives are dead. And it's entirely possible that she'll achieve more and reach greater heights in the majestic world. Because of this, you're choosing to wait silently and hoping to pave a better path for her? Are you hoping to accumulate more wealth and resources to prevent her from dying early again? Thus, it's necessary for you to kill Chan Ping'an, and it's also important for you to obtain all of his numerous treasures. That way, you can give everything to the new Pei Qian, and allow her to cultivate with bountiful resources. Wei Xian clenched his hand into a fist under the table. Cui Dongshan clicked his tongue in wonder and remarked, Master described things very well. That old senior possesses paramount Dao power, and he was able to plan everything perfectly, and also stay within the rules at the same time. He gave Chen Ping'an, Pei Qian and you Wei Xian enough freedom to make your own choices. You were allowed to pursue the great Dao within the constraints of some certain rules. Even though I don't understand Go, I can say with confidence that you Go skills are truly brilliant, Wei Xian praised in a sincere voice. Wei Xian then smiled and asked, However, what if I refuse to admit this to Chan Ping'an? What can you do then, Mr. Cui? Cui Dongshan laughed heartily and replied, Wei Xian, do you truly think you understand Chan Ping'an? Disregarding the unique secret techniques I possess that can ensnare your soul and force you to speak truthfully, I dare say that as long as I recount this conversation to Chan Ping'an and tell him my deductions, your fate will most likely be me drawing a perimeter with my flying sword and blocking out the outside world. Afterward, Chan Ping'an will use his current cultivation base to kill you 3 times over. However, these aren't the most important things. The most important thing is that you'll fail to reunite with the person whom you want to reunite with the most. Wei Xian unclenched his fist under the table and replied in a calm voice, That's indeed the case. This was probably the first time that Cui Dongshan had directly uttered Chan Ping'an's name in front of one of the 4 martial artists from the picture scrolls. After using his flying sword to draw a golden circle, Cui Dongshan retrieved the fleeting glance picture scroll and unfurled it in the air. He plucked out a section of the river of time and chuckled, We can accumulate wealth in peace, and there's no need to fight and kill each other. Your temperament is quite good, but you've stumbled because of your narrow vision. Come over here you old bumpkin. Let me tell you how I used a large pile of shattered and useless bonded porcelain to craft an exquisite and lively person, while I was in the jewel's small world. Open your dog eyes wide and look carefully. I'll show you that the stinky old Taoist priest from the lotus flower-blessed land isn't the only person who can help you. I Cui Dongshan also have an opportunity to grant you your wish. I don't dare to guarantee that I'll succeed, but the chances of success are definitely far greater than you trying to make risky moves right under my nose. What do you say, O founding emperor of the Southern Garden Nation? Approximately 7 to 8 minutes later, Wei Xian stood up, lowering his head and silently cupping his fists in respect. Cui Dongshan also remained silent after putting away the fleeting glance picture scroll. Wei Xian looked up, his fists still cupped in respect as he asked, Mr. Cui, you're the imperial preceptor of the Great Li Empire, embroidered tiger Cui Chan, right? Cui Dongshan raised an eyebrow and replied, As expected of someone who was once an emperor, you can pick up small clues and discover the truth. You're quite a bit smarter than Liu Baixiang. There was a fervent look in Wei Xian's eyes as he asked, Imperial Preceptor, can you tell me how the Great Li Empire, with their initially small territory, managed to conquer half of the entire continent? Cui Dongshan smiled in amusement and replied, What right do you have to make such a request? Wei Xian put his hands down and sat back down in his seat saying, Because Imperial Preceptor is willing to sit in this room and waste his breath with me, someone who's destined to lose. Since you're willing to do this, it means that I have something that you view as valuable. And even if I don't have it today, I'll eventually have it someday in the future. Cui Dongshan nodded and sighed with emotion, replying, Old man Wei, you're a fairly smart person. Talking with you isn't too tiring. Wei Xian hesitated for a moment, and he was just about to speak. However, Cui Dongshan waved a hand and said, I already know what you want to say. This is the true reason why you're still alive. Pei Qian is Master's opening disciple, so if you genuinely steeled your heart and tried to harm her, treating her as nothing more than a puppet and a host body, then you would have been killed long ago, once you revealed any clues. It wouldn't have been me killing you, but rather Qian Ping'an. There was a deep and solemn look in Cui Dongshan's eyes as he continued. You're waiting for an opportunity, while Qian Ping'an is waiting for you to make a move. Well, maybe that's not the case, but I am fairly sure it is. I beg to disagree, Wei Xian said with a shake of his head. Cui Dongshan wrapped his hands behind his head, gazing up at the ceiling as he replied. That's because you're unaware of which people Qian Ping'an has engaged in a mental tug-of-war with before. And that's why I said you, Wei Xian, have a narrow vision. Imperial Preceptor, do you want something else now? Wei Xian asked. Cui Dongshan sighed and said, It's hard to say. I'll have to wait for a while before deciding. Also, remember not to call me Imperial Preceptor in the future. I'm somewhat enemies with myself now. Cui Dongshan stood up and flicked his sleeves, causing a map of the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent to appear on the floor. This was the map of the continent before the Great Li Empire's Imperial Song clan had conquered the Lu Empire. Cui Dongshan walked to the northernmost point of the map, appearing full of spirit and vigor as he laughed heartily and said, I'm bored and have nothing better to do right now, so let me tell you about my glorious achievements in the past. I'll tell you how we marched south. And I'll tell you how the Great Li Empire will transform an entire continent into its own territory in the future. After Pei Qian left the room, Qian Ping'an sat by himself, closing his eyes and resting his mind. He appeared to be slightly exhausted. After a while, he opened his eyes and stood up, walking over to the window. Another spring was about to end. Qian Ping'an rested his arms on the windowsill, smiling as he looked outside. There was a newly built immortal residence in Dawn Cloud Mountain, and this was the cultivation home of celestial maiden Kai Jinjian. The immortal residence was located close to a mountain cliff, giving it a wide field of view and the ability to see far into the distance. Kai Jinjian dismissed her maidservants, who had decent cultivation talent, leaving her alone in her room. She sat down cross-legged on a straw mat, and she held up a picture scroll that she had never shown anyone else before. Kai Jinjian enjoyed great reputation and fame in Dawn Cloud Mountain now, and she had even become a young prodigy who had the right to enjoy an equal standing with Earth immortals from more senior generations. There were numerous immortal forces and immortal clans in the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, yet few young cultivators could enjoy such a privilege. Apart from her explosive rise in cultivation base after her return from the Jewel Small World, there were also many other secrets that were unknown to the outside world. For example, she had a very good relationship with Old Dragon City's Fu Nanhua. After experiencing some huge ups and downs, especially that life and death situation that she hadn't even told her master and sect about, Kai Jinjian had undergone comprehensive transformations in both her cultivation base and her temperament. These transformations astonished and amazed everyone. A few years ago, Kai Jinjian would often leave the mountain to travel around outside. For the past 2 years, however, she would often cultivate in seclusion. Kai Jinjian unfurled the picture scroll in her hand, revealing a Confucian scholar who had graying sideburns and was dressed in an azure robe. She had illustrated this herself. In the eyes of others, Kai Jinjian was someone with an increasingly firm Tao heart, and someone who the great Tao within reach. At this moment, however, she lowered her head, with her eyelashes quivering slightly as she whispered in a soft voice, Mr. Qi. She slowly rolled up the picture scroll and held it against her chest. Meanwhile, her mind had already wandered off to a faraway place. After she had come back to life at that time, Mr. Qi had said that he wanted to make a request before parting ways with her. Kai Jinjian had naturally been willing to accept his request. Mr. Qi had asked her to deliver a fleeting glance picture scroll to the Sword Qi Great Wall, which was located beyond Stalactite Mountain. Afterward, Mr. Qi had asked for her help in sending out several other picture scrolls. The subject of the picture scrolls were none other than that young boy from Clay Vase Alley, and the contents of the picture scrolls reflected Qian Ping'an's life in the Jewel Small World, his long journey to the Great Sui Nation, and his solo trip south to deliver a sword to the Sword Qi Great Wall. The final picture scroll reflected the time period before Qian Ping'an had arrived at the colorful Garment Nation. After delivering this picture scroll, Mr. Qi had thanked Kai Jinjian and bade farewell to her. Kai Jinjian had once mustered her courage and asked in curiosity whether she could view these picture scrolls. Mr. Qi had smiled warmly before nodding and saying that of course she could. Mr. Qi appeared in the final picture scroll, and he left his last messages before passing away. These were messages for that person at the Sword Qi Great Wall. I have an unreasonable request that I sincerely hope you can consider, Miss Ning. Chen Ping'an is willing to treat the world and its people with kindness, so I wish that you can also treat Chen Ping'an with kindness. If you eventually decide that you still don't like Chen Ping'an, then this is okay too. But please don't make my junior brother feel too brokenhearted because of romantic attachments. Qi Jingchen sincerely thanks you in advance. At this moment, Kai Jinjian looked up and dazedly stared into the distance. Mr. Qi always made people feel like they were bathing in the refreshing spring wind. Since they needed to stay in the prefectural city for a day, Chen Ping'an brought Pei Qian out of the inn to sightsee and play. He bought a specialty local product of the Azure Phoenix Nation for her, a fairly expensive sparrowhawk kite from a local kite shop. When Chen Ping'an took out his money to pay for the kite, Pei Qian couldn't help but feel a sharp pang of pain in her heart. She tugged on his sleeve and pointed at a large pile of relatively cheap butterfly kites stacked inside the shop, saying that these kites were actually quite good-looking as well. Chen Ping'an patted her head and replied that there was no need to be too thrifty with these silver coins. After all, her master would budget appropriately for daily expenses. Before buying the sparrowhawk kite, Pei Qian had dearly wanted the kite yet had also felt extremely pained and reluctant to part with so much money. After Chen Ping'an bought the kite for her, however, all she felt was delight and joy. With a saber and a sword crisscrossing by her waist and an expensive sparrowhawk kite in her hands, the smile on Pei Qian's face was so wide that it almost reached her ears. Afterward, Chen Ping'an took Pei Qian to several famous scenic spots in the prefectural city that tourists definitely had to visit. There was City God Temple Street, a temple with pagodas and a forest of steels, the old residence of a previous prime minister, and so on. The two of them wandered around and enjoyed a leisurely morning. Noon arrived and Chen Ping'an brought Pei Qian to a small restaurant to eat. The food was delicious and cheap, but it was a little too spicy for their tastes. Pei Qian's forehead was filled with sweat, and even her vision became blurry because of the sweat trickling down into her eyes. However, her chopsticks still moved like a blur as she ate. When the 3 dishes on the table were almost finished, the sweating Pei Qian vigorously wiped her tanned face. She suddenly discovered that Chen Ping'an had already put down his chopsticks and was looking at her with a smile. Pei Qian also smiled in reply, and she couldn't help but feel a little embarrassed. Her manner of eating was indeed quite terrible, so she definitely needed to hold back a little in the future. Otherwise, she might accidentally lose face for her master when they were traveling around the cultivation world. After returning to 100 Flower Garden, Chen Ping'an helped Pei Qian find a relatively large and empty space in the Immortal in where she could fly her brand new kite. Chen Ping'an sat on a bench in the pavilion and watched the skinny little girl sprinting across the area with the sparrowhawk kite gliding behind her in the wind. His mind was peaceful and calm as he took small sips of osmanthus wine, one of the few pots remaining in his minimization treasure. Pei Qian turned around and asked loudly, "Master, do you want to fly the kite as well?" Pei Qian continued to happily sprint around the area. In 100 Flower Garden, there were a myriad of flowers contending with each other for beauty and uniqueness. This was an indescribably beautiful sight. Cui Dongshan and Sui Yubian walked over to the pavilion, and after bowing and paying his respects, Cui Dongshan sat down cross-legged on a long bench, leaning his back against the vermilion pillar. Sui Yubian didn't sit down and she said, "Chen Ping'an, I'm planning to leave this place and head to the Parasol Leaf Continent's Jade Tablet sect first." Chen Ping'an wasn't surprised and he nodded and replied, "Take care on your journey." Sui Yubian quietly waited for Chen Ping'an to say more, yet it seemed like he had already finished speaking after uttering these 5 words. Sui Yubian's expression was cold, and she neither left the pavilion nor did she say anything else. The atmosphere became extremely awkward as she looked at Chen Ping'an in silence. Chen Ping'an glanced at Cui Dongshan, and the latter immediately understood his master's intentions. He used his golden flying sword to draw a large circle around the pavilion, cutting this area off from the outside world and preventing others inside or outside the Immortal Inn from eavesdropping on their conversation. This wasn't a genuine small world, so Cui Dongshan couldn't necessarily prevent Earth immortals from observing the mountains and rivers through their palms. Even so, he would be able to detect anyone who was trying to do this. At that time, just how difficult would it be to kill a trashy golden core tier cultivator or nascent tier cultivator in a small place? They would do well not to underestimate Cui Dongshan. Only after this did Chen Ping'an say, "Sui Yubian, let me say some honest but harsh words. You might not like what I'm about to say, but you have to finish listening to it anyway. First, I'm only lending deep infatuation to you, so you need to return it to me. The same goes for that dragon slaying platform, and you need to pay me back for it. Second, you becoming an official cultivator of the Greatly Empire is something that we already agreed on, so you can't renege on this promise. Cui Dongshan needs to help you fulfill this promise before you leave. Third, I'll be keeping your picture scroll on me. However, I can't say for certain whether gold essence copper coins will still revive you and allow you to walk out of the picture scroll after you change paths from a pure martial artist to a sword cultivator. You need to be careful when traveling south, and you shouldn't act recklessly. You also need to keep your emotions and temper in check after you arrive at the Jade Tablet sect. As a sword cultivator, practicing sword techniques is a form of cultivation. However, cultivation isn't merely about practicing the sword. Sui Yubian glanced at Chen Ping'an before slowly nodding in response. Cui Dongshan wiped his hand across the corners of his eyes and feigned sadness as he sobbed. This is so touching. If I were a lady with the slightest bit of conscience, then I definitely wouldn't leave after hearing this. He turned around to look at the sparrowhawk kite soaring through the sky outside the pavilion before continuing. Mortal people only say that immortals are carefree and unfettered, while my Tao only envies couples and doesn't envy immortals. Chen Ping'an and Sui Yubian both ignored Cui Dongshan's comedic interjection. Sui Yubian remained silent. Have you prepared some money for your journey? Chen Ping'an asked. Actually, forget that I asked, you definitely haven't prepared anything yet. You and the others didn't have any avenue to make money while we were traveling. How about this, I'll prepare 2 pouches of money for you, 1 pouch of ordinary gold and silver, and 1 pouch of snowflake coins. I barely have any lesser heat coins remaining for myself, and I'm completely out of grain rain coins as well. This means you won't be able to be too extravagant with your spending when you travel south to the Parasol Leaf continent. In fact, you might even need to do some careful planning regarding which travel routes and intercontinental ships you take. You won't be able to stay in the expensive high-grade rooms either. Otherwise, you might have to switch to traveling on foot halfway through your journey. At that time, you'll face a much greater risk of running into trouble. Chen Ping'an suddenly changed his mind and said, Actually, you can travel to Old Dragon City and look for Fan Air first. You can ask him to lend you money. Tell him I agreed to this. He held up a hand and added, 5 grain rain coins at most. 5 at most. Sui Yubian maintained her silence, yet the corners of her lips had already curled up into a slight smile. Chen Ping'an mistakenly thought that she was ridiculing him for being so miserly, so he huffed and said, There's no room for negotiation. You can only borrow a maximum of 5 grain rain coins from Fan Air. Sui Yubian nodded and replied, Understood. Cui Dongshan pondered for a moment, but he eventually decided against overstepping his authority and generously parting with his wealth on behalf of Chen Ping'an. As a pitiful disciple who couldn't escape the fate of being a walking money pouch for his master, it was no big deal for him to help his master and generously part with his wealth when it came to small matters. However, it was best to stand back and let his master decide for himself when it came to important matters that pertained to separation and death. Even so, 2 pouches of money still materialized in Cui Dongshan's hand. After tossing them to Sui Yubian, he turned to Chen Ping'an and chuckled, You can repay me later, master. Chen Ping'an naturally had no issues with this. In reality, neither Chen Ping'an nor Sui Yubian liked to dilly-dally too much. They were both very frank people. Thus, they genuinely fell silent and concluded their conversation after reaching a mutual agreement. Sui Yubian turned around and walked outside the pavilion, and Cui Dongshan removed the golden restriction that he had set up around the perimeter of the structure. Sui Yubian didn't turn around even as she walked down the steps, and Cui Dongshan couldn't help but click his tongue in wonder when he saw this. She was truly a wasteful and cold-hearted woman. But then he smiled knowingly and closed his eyes, clenching his hands into fists as he started to silently count in his mind. He unclenched a finger for each number that he counted. Sui Yubian walked over to Pei Qian after leaving the pavilion, causing the little girl to hurriedly bring in her kite and put it away. She started to chat with Sui Yubian, occasionally nodding or shaking her head as they spoke. After a brief moment, she sprinted into the pavilion and said breathlessly, "Master, Big Sister Sui said that she wants you to see her off. You don't need to accompany her far, just to the entrance of the inn." Right as she said that, Cui Dongshan finished counting to 10, and his clenched fists were now open palms. He laughed loudly and made funny faces at Chan Ping'an. Chan Ping'an felt was a reasonable request, so he quickly caught up to Sui Yubian, who was slowly disappearing into the distance. After Chan Ping'an caught up with her, the two of them remained silent all the way until they reached the entrance of the Immortal Inn. Behind them were the colorful life-size door gods plastered on the front doors of 100 Flower Garden. Sui Yubian stopped walking, and Chan Ping'an also stopped beside her. She didn't look at Chan Ping'an. Instead, she looked up at the clear blue sky as she asked in a soft voice, "Have you always viewed me as a burden? Do you feel much more relaxed now that I've decided to leave?" Chan Ping'an turned around to look at the side of Sui Yubian's face, and he chuckled in reply. "Don't be so pessimistic about people all the time." One had to admit that Sui Yubian was a stunningly beautiful woman, and this was especially the case when she shed her ice-cold expression and appeared like a flower in full bloom. Would Sui Yubian come across a man whom she was attracted to in the cultivation world? Would she become immortal Tao partners with someone when she arrived at the Parasol Leaf Continent's Jade Tablet sect? If she did, then that person would most likely be a young and equally talented sword cultivator, right? Chan Ping'an was quite curious about whom Sui Yubian would take a fancy to in the future. He was also looking forward to their next reunion in the Eastern Treasured Vial Continent, when she would stand next to that person and wave to him in greeting. Chan Ping'an couldn't help but chuckle out loud as he thought about these difficult-to-imagine yet extremely interesting things. Sui Yubian turned around and asked in puzzlement, "What are you chuckling about?" Chan Ping'an didn't dare to reveal his thoughts to Sui Yubian, especially since they were somewhat disrespectful to her. She was easily embarrassed and short-tempered, so he naturally didn't want to turn this amicable farewell into one where he suffered the wrath of her sword. With this in mind, Chan Ping'an simply said, "Take care." Sui Yubian strode away, and she left Chan Ping'an with a message that was spoken softly but carried immense confidence and weight. "It won't be long before I become an upper 5-tier sword immortal." Sui Yubian turned her head and looked back upon reaching the end of the wide street, yet Chan Ping'an was already nowhere to be seen. All she saw were the two colorful door gods. Sui Yubian smiled faintly as she walked away. As if they had planned everything out earlier, Lu Baixiang also came over to Chan Ping'an to request leave soon after Sui Yubian's departure. He explained that he wanted to visit the White Water Temple and all of the other major temples in the Azure Phoenix Nation. Afterward, he would travel around the Fortune Mountain Nation and the Lofty Sky Nation. In other words, it would be a few years before he could travel to Dragon Spring Prefecture, Chan Ping'an's hometown. Chan Ping'an stood in his room and shot a glance at Cui Dongshan, and the latter hurriedly explained, "This has got nothing to do with me. If I'm lying, then I'll use the 5 lightning righteous technique to blast myself to death." Lu Baixiang smiled and said, "This has indeed got nothing to do with Mr. Cui. It's my own decision to visit the temples and travel around the world. Just like my time in the Lotus Flower Blessed Land back then. I want to journey around the world to my heart's content. I hope to reach the 7th tier within the next 3 years, and I also hope that I can reach the 8th tier, the far-roaming tier. That way, I can also travel on the wind and roam afar like chi refiners, allowing me to view all of the stunningly beautiful sights in the mountains. Afterward, I'll fulfill my duty and obediently serve you, all the way until the day I desire adventure and take leave to travel around the world again." Chan Ping'an had only just repaid a pouch of silver coins and a pouch of snowflake coins to Cui Dongshan, yet he was quickly made to give away more money again. He chuckled in irritation and asked, "Go on, tell me. How much money do you need to borrow for your journey?" Lu Baixiang laughed loudly and replied, "I don't need a single immortal coin. Just some silver coins will do." Even though he said this, Chan Ping'an still offered 2 pouches of coins to Lu Baixiang, saying, "Being short a single copper coin can stop a gallant hero in their tracks, so it's best that you accept this pouch of snowflake coins as well." Treat them as emergency funds that you can use if an unexpected situation arises. Lu Baixiang didn't feign politeness and turned down Qian Pingan's offer, and he accepted the 2 pouches of coins before suddenly chuckling in self-ridicule and musing, "Wouldn't it be extremely awkward if I died immediately after leaving?" Qian Pingan smiled and said, "You're almost about to advance to the 7th tier of martial arts, and you're not a hot-headed or reckless person either. These qualities will allow you to travel through the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent without an issue." Lu Baixiang stood up and bid farewell, cupping his fists in respect and saying, "Then it's farewell for now, and we'll meet again in the future?" Qian Pingan also cupped his fists in reply, saying, "Till then." He then seemed to remember something and said in amusement, "Also, this is the majestic world and not the lotus flower-blessed land, so don't try to cook up another demonic sect or whatever." However, Cui Dongshan immediately challenged Qian Pingan's comment and said, "Lu Baixiang isn't an immortal from the mountains, so it won't matter too much if he creates his own force in the cultivation world." "Little Bai, give me a second," Pei Qian suddenly shouted. She turned around and retrieved the scented pouch which Lady Gui had given her, and she was using as a money pouch now. She grabbed a single snowflake coin from it before running over to Lu Baixiang and instructing, "Give me your hand, little Bai." Lu Baixiang smiled and extended a hand. Pei Qian forcefully slapped the snowflake coin into Lu Baixiang's palm before saying in a solemn voice, "This is a present for you, little Bai. This present is quite valuable, and the thought behind it is even weightier." Lu Baixiang wrapped his hand around the snowflake coin. To have this little miser voluntarily give instead of lending him an immortal coin, the thought behind this present was indeed very weighty. Lu Baixiang smiled faintly and said, "Rest assured. I'll help you keep an eye out for any treasures while I travel around the cultivation world for the next few years. If I can obtain these treasures, then I'll give them to you as greeting gifts in the future." Pei Qian nodded earnestly and said in a serious voice, "Traveling and enjoying yourself is one thing, but remember not to slack off on your martial arts cultivation. Practicing martial arts is like traveling against the current, so if you stop training and moving forward, then you can only move backward. You need to learn from me. I transcribe books, practice walking meditation, and practice my sword and saber techniques every single day. I'm very diligent and work extremely hard. After all, a clumsy bird must fly first." 1. Lu Baixiang reached over and said with a smile, "I understand." Pei Qian nimbly dodged the hand that was reaching over to pat her head, and she complained, "That will stop me from growing taller." However, she quickly flashed a dazzling smile at Qian Pingan and said, "Of course, it's all right if Master pats my head." Lu Baixiang laughed heartily, and he eventually looked toward the young immortal in white robes sitting beside Qian Pingan with his legs crossed. Cui Dongshan raised a hand, gesturing for Lu Baixiang to swallow his words before saying, "Is there any need for men like us to dawdle around and act so emotionally?" Lu Baixiang left in a carefree and leisurely manner. The room fell silent. After a while, Qian Pingan asked, "Do I need to keep preparing? Will Julien be next? Or will Wei Xian be next?" Cui Dongshan pointed at himself. Pei Qian struggled to contain her laughter and keep a straight face. Cui Dongshan grabbed a jujube and flicked it away, accurately striking the center of Pei Qian's forehead. Pei Qian bent down and caught the jujube. However, she didn't dare to eat it, afraid that Cui Dongshan would make up some other story to frighten her. She only dared to place it back on the small plate on the table before sitting down next to Qian Pingan. "You're not going to observe the debate between Buddhism and Taoism in the Azure Phoenix Nation?" Qian Pingan asked. Cui Dongshan shook his head and revealed a secret, saying, "Ordinary people will only be able to see 2 groups of people arguing in the heart of the capital. However, it's quite uninteresting to watch those bull-nosed Taoist priests and bald donkey monks slinging nonsense at each other. The true competition pertains to the reincarnation of that profound Buddhist monk at the White Water Temple, as well as the temple master of the Azure Phoenix Nation's White Cloud Taoist Temple. One used to be a renowned eminent monk in his past life, and he's equally as wise and enlightened in his current life. The other doesn't have any background to speak of. He's simply a middle-aged Taoist priest who likes to read books. However, he can understand everything that he reads. Even though the true competition is between these 2 individuals, few people will cast their gaze over to this side. Those who do are all powerful and troublesome entities. There's Lakeview Academy, the Cloud Forest Zhang clan, and perhaps there'll be many other immortals and elites flocking here from all over the world. Among them, there might be some old bastards who haven't shown their faces for a long time. Chen Ping'an nodded and concurred. Caution is the key to longevity. Cui Dongshan stood up to bow and apologize, saying, I need to bring Wei Xian with me on this trip. Can you please approve this request, master? Chen Ping'an crunched down on a juju before smiling and replying, Shouldn't I be the one thanking you? In a rare turn of events, Cui Dongshan surprisingly didn't utter any unbelievable nonsense this time. He placed his arms on the table and interlocked his fingers, saying slowly, The situation in the central region of the Eastern Treasured Vile continent is quite complicated right now. Things are chaotic both inside the mountains and outside the mountains, and many vagrant cultivators are taking advantage of this opportunity to make a huge killing. These cultivators are extremely ferocious and merciless, and many of them have already capitalized on this chance to become Earth Immortals. Some of these cultivators are from proper immortal forces and clans, yet they completely toss the rules and etiquette aside to achieve their goals. Meanwhile, Bamboo Scroll Lake has always been a pungent pool filled with all manner of weak shrimp. I suggest that you travel to the Great Sway Nation's Mountain Cliff Academy first after leaving the capital of the Azure Phoenix Nation. While you're there, you can also use the opportunity to refine that golden scholarly core into your second bonded item. I'll write a letter for you. Apart from the Great Li Empire directly delivering all of the remaining gold essence copper coins to the Academy, Mao Xiaodong will also act as a guard for you at that time. This is merely icing on the cake, but it can also be regarded as a formless act of helping those in dire straits from the viewpoint of the Great Sway Nation's Imperial Gao clan. Master, you don't need to feel like you're taking advantage of others. There's a thriving scholarly culture in the Great Sway Nation to begin with, so it's naturally the most suitable location to refine that golden scholarly core of yours. Afterward, it's up to you whether you go on another trip to the Colorful Garment Nation, the Watercombing Nation, and so on. Of course, you can also return to Dragon Spring Prefecture to check on your ancestral home. Both of these options are fine. Once all of this is done, it will be a good time for you to visit Bamboo Scroll Lake. The central region of the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent would have already regained stability at the time, so it wouldn't surprise me if the peace and safety tablets bestowed by the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent's Ministry of Rights skyrocket in value and gain the ability to deter Earth Immortals. Chen Ping'an mulled over this for a long time, and he also grabbed the sword nurturing gourd from his waist to take small sips of medicinal wine. He eventually nodded and replied, Okay, this sounds like a good plan. I'll do something along those lines after I leave the Azure Phoenix Nation. Cui Dongshan breathed a long sigh of relief, and he didn't conceal the fact that a huge weight had been lifted off his shoulder. Rest assured, Master, there's no hidden scheme to harm you or take advantage of you here. In any case, you and I are on the same boat and traveling on the same path now. The more impressive your achievements are, the more I can bask in your glory. This is the case even if I slack off and do nothing all day long. My standing will be naturally dragged up thanks to your wonderful achievements. Chen Ping'an hesitated for a brief moment before asking, How do you communicate with your other self that's in the capital of the Great Li Empire? Cui Dongshan's head forcefully banged into the table. He looked extremely dejected, as if he were bordering on the verge of wanting to die. He banged his head against the table 3 times before looking up and replying, My heart aches whenever I talk about this. You brought all of this upon yourself, so there's naturally no one you can blame apart from yourself, Chen Ping'an replied with a chuckle. But why is that old geezer the one who gets to enjoy life and continue on as the mighty imperial preceptor of the Great Li Empire? Cui Dongshan asked in an aggrieved voice. On the other hand, I've even lost my nickname of Embroidered Tiger. Every time I go outside, I'm also forced to camp in the wilderness and hide from dangers. Chen Ping'an gloated over Cui Dongshan's misfortune and replied, You should be grateful for what you have. Apart from the myriad of treasures in your minimization treasure, you also have this immortal body that is even better than Du Mao's avatar. Cui Dongshan sighed and rested his cheek on his palm. Looking up at the sky, he said, That's true. Thankfully, I'm not especially interested in fighting and killing people anymore. However, I'm still a young boy after all, so it's quite easy for me to become bored. Things have been better since I left the academy in the Great Sway Nation, and I've enjoyed my time interacting with you every day for the past while. Back at East Mountain, little Baoping always ignored me, Yu Lu and Xie annoyed me, and I had nothing to talk about with Li Huai and Lin Shui. I was so lonely and pitiful back there. Chen Ping'an couldn't be bothered trying to console him. In any case, did the Great Li Empire's embroidered tiger need anyone to console him? What an absolute joke. Cui Dongshan sat up straight and chuckled. Master, it can be said that we've temporarily reached the endgame regarding the 4 people from the Lotus Flower-blessed land. Let me review things for Master, and we can treat this as a final lesson about go beyond go before I bid farewell. Chen Ping'an subconsciously assumed a proper sitting posture. He would always be this serious and proper when learning Go from Cui Dongshan, and he said, Please go ahead. Cui Dongshan found this somewhat funny, yet he also felt slightly melancholy at the same time. However, he concealed these emotions extremely well, not allowing them to show on his face at all. He first used his flying sword to draw a perimeter around them. That Sui Yubian is a silly girl. She's like a porcelain vase from the Dragon Kills. Something that's beautiful on the outside yet fragile when struck. But even though she's silly, she is indeed an innate sword talent. If the Jade Tablet sect is willing to invest in her and raise her, it's entirely possible that she can become a nascent tier sword cultivator. As for whether she can become an upper 5-tier sword immortal, this isn't something that she can decide by herself. She needs to ask this heaven and earth whether they agree first. Regardless, Sui Yubian can be regarded as the most fortunate out of the 4 people from the Lotus Flower-blessed land. Moreover, you have truly taken good care of her during your time together. She died 3 times. Yet her mental state surprisingly didn't crumble. Instead, it became even more dazzling. There was a strange look in Chen Ping'an's eyes. Cui Dongshan held up his index and middle fingers in a kind of oath and said in a categorical manner, I swear to the heavens that I wasn't implying anything else. I definitely wasn't trying to insinuate anything. Chen Ping'an handed Pei Qian a fragrant pear that was as white as snow. Pei Qian accepted the pear and rubbed it between her hands a few times, giving it a brief clean before starting to gnaw on it. Cui Dongshan continued to review the situation, saying, As for the troublesome Wei Xian, I've already dealt with this issue for you, Master. At the end of the day, he's nothing more than a naive and foolish man. There's no need to say anything more. Cui Dongshan had initially wanted to place a heavier emphasis on this and expand on his thrilling exchange with Wei Xian, yet he quickly noticed the meaningful look in Chen Ping'an's eyes. Just how astute was Cui Dongshan? He immediately understood Chen Ping'an's intention and changed his tone, skipping over the details and stating that there was nothing more to say. Cui Dongshan shot a sideways glance at Pei Qian, who was calmly eating fruit, and huffed, Eat, eat, eat. All you can do is eat. You don't have any observation skills at all. However, he quickly faced the consequences, with Chen Ping'an kicking him under the table. Cui Dongshan huffed and continued, Lu Baixiang is an extremely talented person, and there's a chance for him to become a universally talented person. It's just that it will be extremely difficult for him to reach the peak of martial arts. Advancing to the 9th tier won't be difficult, but he doesn't need to dream about advancing to the 10th tier unless a profound fated opportunity descends from the heavens. Of course, even in the Great Li Empire of the future, 9th tier martial artists will still be transcendent beings who possess a certain amount of martial fortune. With how good Lu Baixiang's brain is, I can teach him some heretical methods in the future, and allow him to become a relatively powerful lackey. No, a good subordinate. Pei Qian shot a glare at him and scolded, Speak properly in front of our master. You're not allowed to spew nonsense and insult old man Wei and little Bai. Cui Dongshan smiled with squinted eyes and replied, Should I tell you a story about ghosts and spirits related to the fragrant pear in your hand? Pei Qian immediately smiled and said, Striving to be better after seeing the errors in your way is an amazing quality to have. Master won't be disappointed to have a disciple like you. Cui Dongshan copied Pei Qian's tone, lightly waving a hand before clicking his tongue in wonder and saying, It's also an amazing thing for Master to have an unyielding and impressive disciple such as yourself. Pei Qian pretended to be deaf and mute as she sat there and smiled. Cui Dongshan's expression changed slightly, and he said in a solemn voice, Julien is the only one who looks like he won't get too hung up on things. He appears to make the best of what he has, and it seems like he can live a happy life no matter where he goes. However, this also signifies that his feelings fluctuate the most. He was born into a wealthy family in the lotus flower-blessed land, and he was once a peerlessly handsome young master with both wealth and influence. Yet, he ran away to practice martial arts, and he genuinely managed to become the most powerful martial artist in the world. He's skilled at cooking, and he's especially fond of delicious food. He also says that he wants to capture the heart of a beautiful woman. Moreover, he's also a flexible person who can adapt to the situation. Taking all of this into account, Zhu Lian has the broadest outlook and highest ambition out of the 4 people from the picture scrolls. Pei Qian nodded earnestly in response. Out of the 4, she was indeed most afraid of the hunchbacked old man called Zhu Lian. Cui Dongshan suddenly chuckled and continued. People like him aren't attached to anything, so if you don't teach him well, it's entirely possible that Zhu Lian might sell you out one day. If you do teach him well, however, you'll be given a pleasant surprise in the future. At that time, Zhu Lian will be the only one out of the 4 people who will be willing to die for your sake. Moreover, he'll strive toward death resolutely, and he won't hesitate at all. This will be the case even if he's on his final life. As for the 3 other people, I'm able to manage and control them to some extent. However, I can't do anything about Zhu Lian. Only you will be able to teach him, master. Seeing the look of slight puzzlement on Qian Ping'an's face, Cui Dongshan explained patiently, Sui Yubian can't become as loyal as Zhu Lian because she's pursuing the sword Dao. This is what she desires the most. Meanwhile, Lu Baixiang appears to be the most like-minded with you, but that isn't actually the case. If anything, he's rather cold and heartless. Cui Dongshan didn't say the rest aloud, and he instead used his mind's voice to secretly tell Qian Ping'an. Wei Xian feels like he can't die yet because he's still yet to fulfill his wish. He was also an emperor in the past, so apart from the attachment in his heart, he also believes that everyone in the world can be killed, and everything in the world can be sold. Regarding his attachment, please don't blame me for being too nosy, master. I need to use my relationships in the Parasol Leaf continent to do some digging about the family life of Wei Xian during the earlier years of his rule in the Southern Garden Nation. Be careful and take it easy when it comes to matters pertaining to the old Taoist priest from the Observing Tao Temple, Qian Ping'an said in reminder. Cui Dongshan smiled and replied, I'll definitely be very careful around that stinky old man. To be honest, I didn't dare to provoke him even when I was at the peak stage of the 12th tier, the immortal tier, in the past. By the way, the old scholar actually has a fairly interesting relationship with him. Cui Dongshan fell silent for a moment before standing up and pacing back and forth. He rubbed his palms together, and it was as if he were teaching Qian Ping'an how to play Go. At the same time, it also seemed like he was reviewing the events that had affected the scholarly sage's lineage all those years ago. His voice was soft as he continued, Please remember this, master. Regardless of whether it's your disciples or disciples of the sect, an immortal force must have a varied mix of people. Can't have just a single type of people. More importantly, it shouldn't have a single type of people who are all like the master. It shouldn't be the case that everyone is as kind, friendly, and noble as you, and it shouldn't be the case that everyone only focuses on exploring profound principles and writing essays about morality and etiquette. Similarly, it shouldn't be the case that everyone is brainless and only knows how to fight. There need to be people like me who can go against their conscience and can find loopholes in the rules and regulations. There needs to be detestable people who understand the bigger picture and understand how to act according to the greater trend. These people can highlight your good qualities and allow your image to remain as lofty as the mountains and as bright as the moon. There needs to be someone who only acknowledges you, with your life and death being equivalent to their own life and death. In fact, your life should be even more important than theirs. There need to be people who can inherit your knowledge and teachings, and these people need to be genuinely like-minded and walk along the same scholarly great Tao. These people will be ideal for creating a good environment in the sect. There needs to be those who can deter sinister people and heretical individuals, and they especially need to guard against fake noble scholars and genuinely crazy people. For example, there needs to be someone like Zhu Lian. There have to be wealthy individuals, for example, that person in the bamboo building in Downtrodden Mountain. Okay, you are probably aware that person is my grandpa. There also have to be amusing people who display a sense of innocence and childlike humor, lest the sect become too solemn and lifeless. For example, there's the water snake and the fire python that I helped you subdue in the Yellow Court Nation all those years ago. To put it simply, There needs to be someone who can subdue others through reason when you are speaking reason with others. There needs to be someone who can step forward and subdue others through the strength of their morality when master is comparing his great Tao to someone else's. If there are people who like to resort to violence when we're speaking reason, yet they pretend to be pitiful when we're forced to get physical and subdue them, then there needs to be someone who can help master beat these people into submission. Afterward, master simply needs to scold them a bit and maybe provide some minor compensation to those who have been beaten black and blue. For example, master can offer them a jujube to eat. That way, outsiders won't be able to find any problems with our sex people, culture, and teachings. Here Cui Dongshan stood up and chuckled. I'm just voicing my thoughts and giving some casual suggestions. I'll be satisfied if you are willing to consider some of these suggestions. Still sitting upright, Chan Ping'an replied. Thank you for enlightening me. Cui Dongshan looked at Chan Ping'an's gleaming eyes before bowing in respect and saying with a smile, O noble and elegant person, take a knife and file to sharpen your knowledge, take a chisel and sand to polish your character. Listening to Cui Dongshan's words hurt Pei Qian's brain. Cui Dongshan suddenly changed the topic to something completely different, chuckling. There are two things in the capital of the Azure Phoenix Nation that you must try if you get the opportunity. One is Buddha's temptation and one is bittern flapjack, something that you can find in those old shops located deep inside the alleys. One is fancy and one is basic, yet both are incredible delicacies of the world. Sure, Chen Ping'an replied with a smile. Master, as fellow disciples of yours, I want to have a private conversation with Pei Qian. Is that all right? Cui Dongshan asked carefully. I might leave with Wei Xian immediately after I finish my conversation with Pei Qian, so there's no need for you to come over to see me off. After we leave, only Shiro and Julian will remain to act as your subordinates. Chan Ping'an nodded and turned around to look at Pei Qian. The skinny little girl immediately jumped up and exclaimed, Who's afraid of whom? Cui Dongshan smiled and walked out of the room. Pei Qian followed after him, and she turned around to smile at Chan Ping'an as she stepped over the door threshold. She waved her fist around to boost her own courage. However, once she walked into the long corridor where she couldn't see Chan Ping'an anymore, she immediately retrieved her treasure pagoda demon-suppressing talisman and stuck it on her forehead. Only after doing this did she continue to follow Cui Dongshan. In Cui Dongshan's room, Pei Qian immediately acted like an obedient lackey and closed the door for him. There was an obsequious smile on her face as she sat down beside the table. She grabbed a fragrant pear and said, You're my senior brother, so let me wipe this pear clean for you. It's delicious and hydrating. Cui Dongshan rolled his eyes and snapped, Oh, piss off, will you? Senior brother? How about I refer to you as senior sister? Pei Qian hurriedly shook her hand and replied, No, that definitely won't do. We're cultivating under the same master, so there has to be a proper notion of seniority. Pei Qian nodded earnestly like a young chick pecking rice as she replied, Yes, that's right. I'm still little, so it's true that I'm not very impressive. Cui Dongshan stood up and retrieved the fleeting glance picture scroll. He didn't unfurl it straight away and he instead asked, What do you think your master's life was like when he was little? Pei Qian faltered for a moment before replying, Master mentioned it to me before, and I've also heard him chat about it with other people. He was quite poor when he was little, and he grew up in the Jewel Small World's clay vase alley or something. Cui Dongshan slowly unfurled the fleeting glance picture scroll before beckoning at Pei Qian and saying, Then come here and take a look. Reflected on the picture scroll was the river outside the small town as well as the covered bridge that spanned across it. Of course, this covered bridge had been dismantled and no longer existed anymore. Cultivators in the world understand that the waters are more dangerous than the mountains, Cui Dongshan explained slowly. This is because the sages of the 100 schools of thought are far fonder of water than they are mountains. Paramount virtue is like water, wise individuals enjoy the waters, and Buddha observes a bowl of water. All of these sayings relate to water. As for the profound truth buried within this, you'll naturally learn of it in the future. Afterward, the fleeting glance picture scroll reflected the scenes of Chan Ping'an's childhood. There were children flying paper kites in the immortal tomb, and there was a tanned little boy squatting far away in the distance and looking on in envy. He watched the children the same age as him sprinting through the immortal tomb with their kites soaring high in the sky. There were the times when he went to the Yang family's medicine shop to buy medicine, and he would return home to brew medicine while he stood on top of a small stool to cook. He would secretly run to the immortal tomb to pray in front of the damaged statues of the gods and deities as well. Afterward, the little boy carried a huge basket that was almost as big as himself as he climbed up a mountain under the scorching sun to collect medicinal herbs. However, it wasn't long before he experienced searing pain in his shoulders, so he shrugged off the huge basket and bawled his eyes out at the foot of the mountain. One time he was so hungry that he paced up and down Cultivation Alley again and again, all the way until a woman eventually opened her door and invited him inside. Time slowly trickled along, and the scenes on the picture scroll slowly appeared and faded. The little boy grew up into a young boy. In the end, the picture scroll froze on the scene where Jian Lai was standing at the eastern gate of the small town and waiting to deliver letters to earn some copper coins. Pei Qian was glued to the fleeting glance picture scroll, and her expression changed again and again as she watched the changing scenes on the picture scroll for more than an hour. Absorbed by the scenes, Pei Qian would occasionally mutter to herself as well, saying, "This song Jisun and you both deserve to die. In fact, I coincidentally have a saber and a sword for them. In the future, I'll use my saber to behead one of them, and I'll use my sword to stab one of them in the heart. No wonder Master knows how to do everything, from making straw sandals to building bamboo bookcases. Haha. Master is also drooling at the sight of Tonghulu? Huh. Why did Master run away? Didn't the man selling Tonghulu offer one to Master for free? I don't understand. This effeminate man from the Dragon Kills is quite similar to that old geezer, Sure Ro. Is this tree above the grave mound the model tree that Master mentioned to Little Bai? Why does this old man Yao always like to scold Master? Is he blind or what? Is this big sister standing outside the door the girl that Master likes? She doesn't appear to be much more beautiful than Sui Yubian. In fact, she doesn't seem as beautiful as Taoist Nun Huang Ting, the person who taught me sword and saber techniques." There was a loud crack. Cui Dongshan rolled up the picture scroll and placed it back inside his minimization treasure. Pei Qian silently sat on the stool. Cui Dongshan sat beside her and said with a nonchalant expression, "Your master didn't drink much when the two of us reviewed his journey through the lotus flower-blessed land. However, he drank quite a bit when he started to talk about you, Pei Qian. He said that he initially thought all of the parents in the world would try their hardest to give the best things to their children. He only later found out that this wasn't the case. How could a mother secretly hide a steamed bun and choose to eat it by herself at night? Why was she unwilling to take it out and share it with her daughter who was almost about to die of starvation?" Pei Qian hung her head in dejection. "I need to thank you, Pei Qian. From the beginning to the end, you allowed Master to better understand just how many people in the world are both foolish and bad." Cui Dongshan continued in a calm voice. "Do you know which 3 events were the most challenging for your master when he was in the small town?" Cui Dongshan asked. Pei Qian rested her arms and head on the table and murmured in reply, "There was the time when Master was pacing up and down Cultivation Alley thinking about what to do if no one opened their door for him. That woman eventually opened her door and invited Master inside, so he treated the snotty little kid very well afterward. Another significant challenge was when Master went into the mountains to collect medicinal herbs for the first time. And that's why Master is so grateful to Old Man Yang. As for the final challenge, I can't think of anything else." Cui Dongshan was relatively satisfied with Pei Qian's performance, and he said with a smile, "You won't be able to figure this out regardless of how hard you rack your brain. It was that stick of Tonghulu." Pei Qian turned around, with her cheek still resting on the table as she looked at Cui Dongshan in slight puzzlement. Cui Dongshan's voice was soft as he explained, "If it were you instead of your master, then you could have freely eaten that stick of Tonghulu without any issues. You could have fallen to your knees to beg for some Tonghulu, you could have stolen some Tonghulu, you could have snatched away some Tonghulu, and you could have even devoured an entire stand of Tonghulu. None of this would have been an issue. However, Jian Lai couldn't eat the stick of Tonghulu. In fact, he couldn't eat a single candied hawthorn at all. All matters in the world, all people in the world, and the intentions of people regarding the matters in the world. All of this seems complicated, yet in reality, there are clues and traces for us to follow if we can observe the minute details of the relevant events." Pei Qian suddenly flared up in anger and exclaimed, "Refer to him as Master. You actually dared to utter Master's name? How impudent. I'll tell master. Cui Dongshan rolled his eyes and feigned a flicking motion. Pei Qian hurriedly sat up and used both her hands to guard her forehead and her precious talisman. Cui Dongshan placed his hands inside his sleeves and leaned against the table, gazing outside the window as he remarked in a soft voice, "We shouldn't disappoint master all the time." This confused Pei Qian quite a bit. All the time. However, she wasn't confused for too long. Casually counting on her fingers, she realized that she had indeed angered Chen Ping'an quite a few times. Cui Dongshan turned around and looked at Pei Qian with a smile, saying, "The heavens have the sun and the moon to illuminate all matter, and humans have 2 eyes to clearly observe all situations. Pei Qian, you're a very fortunate person, and you're even more fortunate that you were able to come across Chen Ping'an. This is just like how Chen Ping'an was able to come across Qi Jingchen." Cui Dongshan seemed slightly adrift as he murmured with a faint smile, "I remember the time when that old scholar was experiencing the most challenging period of his life. He faced his only 3 disciples at the time, me, that person who's not very smart, and Mr. Qi, whom Chen Ping'an respects immensely, and he said that if we can live a peaceful life, then it isn't too important whether we're rich or poor. If we're satisfied, then even ordinary water will taste like sweet wine, and even plain steamed buns will taste like grilled drumsticks." After hearing this, the person with the surnames was stupidly remarked that one wouldn't starve to death even if they had nothing but water and steamed buns to eat all their life, so that was good enough for him. The old scholar was infuriated, and he smacked the table and glared at his disciple, asking him to show a bit more ambition. If we didn't use these principles to stave off hunger when we were poor, then how could we possibly have the motivation to keep going? How could there possibly be a fool in the world who didn't want to enjoy a better life? If everyone wants to live a better life, and if everyone attempts to achieve this through proper means, then the world will move in an upward trajectory of improvement. Qi Jingchen then asked our master when we could eat some dishes cooked with oil. Our master was instantly deflated, and he was rendered speechless for a long time. In the end, he could only point at me, the bullshit senior brother of Zuoyu and Qi Jingchen, and say with a wide smile that it would depend on when my family sent some money over. Of course, outsiders and future generations naturally aren't aware of these conversations. Everything was left behind in the small private school in that impoverished alley. Afterward, the old scholar participated in the debate between the 3 teachings 2 times, and he ended up with a huge number of official and unofficial disciples. He was renowned throughout the world. But the 3 of us, his initial disciples, aren't really willing to remember these times. The old scholar seemed extremely busy during that time, and he would run here, run there, and run everywhere. He would bust his chops for the so-called people of the world. He needed to travel to all of the Confucian schools and academies, and he needed to lecture, teach, and answer the questions of many utter fools. As time went on, the 3 of us, his earliest and most prized disciples, each embarked on our own paths of the great Tao. Pei Qian couldn't hear him properly, and this was because Cui Dongshan was speaking far too softly. Cui Dongshan took a deep breath before flicking his 2 sleeves, causing them to look like tumbling snowflakes in the sky. He looked at Pei Qian and said with a faint smile, "Being able to leave one's body is like a bird being set free from its cage. The world is bright and clear, just like the radiant moon shining inside colored glaze. Since you're not suited to learning your master's fist techniques and have chosen to start practicing the sword and the saber instead, then you need to master the quick and blissful sword and aim to launch the quickest sword attack possible, so fast that it can rival lightning, and so fast that a single sword strike can shatter all techniques. You also need to master the carefree saber. You must unsheath and resheath your saber in a single instant, and by the time it's back in the scabbard, heads must be rolling." Pei Qian furrowed her brow and replied, "Are you my master or something?" Cui Dongshan smiled widely and said, "No, but you're my senior sister. Since I'm looking out for you now, you naturally need to look out for me in the future. This is what it means to have a praiseworthy relationship between fellow disciples." Pei Qian blinked and said, "You're not lying to me, are you? If you are, then I'm not going to become your senior sister." Cui Dongshan recalled something at this moment, and he retrieved a small item that was folded into the shape of a paper crane, saying, "Take care of this. When you continue this long journey with Master, remember that you can only retrieve this item and show it to him when he reaches his angriest state. Well, I hope that it's still unused when I reunite with him again in the future." Here, put it in your scented pouch. Remember not to open it up without permission, or else you'll have to face the consequences yourself. Pei Qian nodded in response and carefully placed the item inside her scented pouch. Cui Dongshan pointed at the dazzling golden perimeter around them and asked, "Don't you have a hiking pole? Do you want to learn this mystical ability of mine?" "I don't have any money left," Pei Qian replied. "I gave everything to Little Bai to use as travel expenses." The mention of this instantly reminded Pei Qian of another tragic matter. She had played 5 in a row with this person and lost a whopping 7 copper coins to him. Cui Dongshan waved a hand and chuckled. "Talking about money too much is bound to detrimentally affect relationships. You don't need to pay me. You can simply treat this as compensation for completing that small task for me." In the end, Chan Ping'an still accompanied Cui Dongshan to the entrance of the Immortal Inn and saw him off. Wei Xian and Pei Qian were still chatting with each other. Zhu Lian and Shi Rou were standing behind Chan Ping'an. Cui Dongshan smiled at the two people and said, "The two of you need to remember to look after my master. Okay?" Zhu Lian nodded and replied with a faint smile, "Your teacher is also my master, so I'll naturally look after him." Meanwhile, there were mixed emotions running through Shi Rou's mind. She would feel absolutely terrified when Cui Dongshan was present, yet she would feel extremely anxious about her future when he was absent. Cui Dongshan bowed in respect and said in farewell, "The journey ahead of us is still long. Take care, master." After Cui Dongshan straightened up, Chan Ping'an suddenly raised an arm and gave a thumbs up behind his back to Du Mao, saying in a low voice, "Beautifully done. Both Zheng Dafeng and I need to thank you." After trying to find the right words for half a day, Cui Dongshan finally struggled to flatter his master for the first time, saying in an awkward voice, "Master, you're truly a kind-hearted person.